Welcome, brave souls, to Angelical Balance, where true horror stories pierce the veil between worlds. I'm your host for today, guiding you through the shadows. Before we unravel tonight's chilling tale, smash that like button if you're ready to be spooked. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from, your city, country, or maybe a haunted attic, and tell us if you've ever felt a chill you couldn't explain. Got a creepy story of your own? We're one click away. Just email us your tale, and I might share it on the channel. Please check the description for the email. Subscribe for more terrifying tales every week. Grab your headphones, and let's find the balance between fear and fascination as we dive into the darkness.
My name is Marcus Riley, and I've been running fishing charters out of Key West for 23 years. I've seen my share of strange things on the water, water spouts, bizarre marine life, even what I'm pretty sure was a small meteor hitting the ocean about half a mile from my boat. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened in August of last year. I had a group of 4 guys from Ohio who'd booked a 3-day deep-sea fishing trip. They were good customers, experienced fishermen, respectful of the ocean, and they tipped well. We'd had a successful first 2 days, pulling in some nice mahi-mahi and a couple of small marlins. On the 3rd day, they wanted to try something different. They'd heard about night fishing for swordfish and were willing to pay extra for the experience. I'll be honest, I wasn't thrilled about it. Night fishing is a different beast entirely. The ocean changes when the sun goes down. It becomes something else, something older. But they were paying customers, and the forecast looked good, so I agreed. We headed out around 7 p.m., just as the sun was starting to set. The sky was doing that thing it does in the Keys, turning shades of orange and pink that don't seem like they should exist in nature. The water was calm, almost glassy, and there was barely any wind. Perfect conditions, really. We motored out about 15 miles offshore to a spot I knew well. A drop-off where the continental shelf falls away into deeper water. This is where the big fish come up at night to feed. By the time we got our lines in the water, it was fully dark. No moon that night, just stars and the glow of our boat lights reflecting off the black water. The first couple of hours were uneventful. We had some bites, lost a few fish, the usual. The guys were drinking beer, telling stories, having a good time. I was in the cabin monitoring the instruments and keeping an eye on the weather radar. Everything was normal. Around 11 p.m., one of the guys, Brad I think his name was, got a solid hit. His rod bent nearly double and the reel started screaming. Whatever he'd hooked into was big and running deep. The other guys gathered around, excited, offering advice and encouragement. I came out of the cabin to help. Brad fought that fish for nearly 40 minutes. Every time he'd gain some line, the fish would take off again, pulling drag like nothing I'd seen before. My arms were getting tired just watching him. Finally, we started seeing color. The fish was coming up. That's when things got weird. As the fish came closer to the surface, I noticed something odd about the water. It was glowing. Not like bioluminescence, which I'd seen plenty of times. This was different. The glow was a pale green color, and it seemed to be coming directly beneath the fish, rising up with it. "You guys seeing this?" one of the men asked. We all saw it. The green glow was getting brighter as the fish approached the surface. And there was something else. A smell. Sharp and chemical, like ammonia mixed with something rotten. Brad finally got the fish alongside the boat. It was a swordfish, maybe 200 pounds. A beautiful catch. But as I reached for the gaff, I noticed its eyes. They were milky white, completely clouded over. The fish was dead, probably been dead for a while based on how its flesh looked, but it had fought like it was alive. "Don't touch it," I said, pulling my hand back. Something about this wasn't right. That's when the green glow beneath the boat intensified. It was so bright now that it illuminated the entire area around us, turning the black water into an eerie phosphorescent pool. And in that light, we could see shapes moving beneath the surface. Lots of them. Large shapes, circling the boat. "What the hell is that?" Brad whispered, still holding his rod with the dead swordfish dangling from the line. "I've been on the ocean my entire life. I know sharks, I know dolphins, I know whales. These weren't any of those things. The shapes were wrong. Too long, too serpentine. They moved in a way that didn't match any marine life I'd ever encountered, undulating through the water with an alien grace. One of them surfaced about 20 feet from the boat. I only saw it for a second, but that second is burned into my memory forever. It looked like an eel, but massive, maybe 30 feet long and as thick as a telephone pole. Its skin was translucent, and through it I could see what looked like organs or maybe lights inside its body, pulsing with that same green glow. And its head was flat and wide, with a mouth that seemed too large for its body."
It looked at us. And I know how that sounds, but I swear it looked directly at us, with eyes that seemed far too intelligent. And then it dove back under, creating a surge that rocked the boat. "Cut the line!" I shouted at Brad. "Cut it now!" He fumbled with his knife and finally severed the line. The dead swordfish sank immediately, and as it did, the shapes beneath us converged on it. The water churned and frothed, and for a moment the green glow intensified to the point where it was almost painful to look at. Then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The glow faded. The water went black again. The shapes were gone. We stood there on the deck, not speaking, barely breathing. The only sound was the idle of the engines and the gentle lap of water against the hull. "Did that just happen?" one of the guys finally asked. I didn't answer. I was already heading to the cabin to start the engines. "We're going back," I announced. "Trip's over." Nobody argued. The ride back to Key West was silent. The men sat in the cabin, occasionally glancing at each other but not speaking. I kept the throttle wide open, wanting to put as much distance between us and that spot as possible. When we got back to the marina around 2 a.m., the guys gathered their gear quickly and left without much conversation. Brad tried to tip me extra, but I waved him off. Money felt wrong somehow, like accepting payment for witnessing something we weren't supposed to see. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my apartment, drinking coffee and watching the sun come up, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. I pulled up everything I could find online about bioluminescent sea creatures, deep-sea organisms, anything that might explain it. Nothing came close. The next day I went down to the marina early. I needed to talk to someone, and old Ray seemed like the right choice. Ray had been fishing these waters since before I was born. If anyone had seen something like this before, it would be him. I found him on his boat mending nets. When I described what we'd seen, he stopped working and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "How deep were you?" he asked. "About 15 miles out, over the drop-off." He nodded slowly, like this confirmed something. "You fished the trench." "What trench?" "There's a deep-water trench out there, runs along the shelf, goes down maybe 6,000–7,000 feet in places. Most of us avoid it, especially at night." "Why? What's down there?" Ray went back to his nets. "Things that should stay down there. Things that sometimes come up when they're curious or hungry, or just because they can. You're lucky, Marcus. Whatever you saw, it let you leave." "What do you mean, let us leave?" But Ray wouldn't say anything more. He just kept working on his nets, and after a while I left. I haven't been back to that spot since. I still run charters, but I tell customers we only do day trips now. When they ask about night fishing, I make up excuses. Weather's too unpredictable, equipment's not suited for it, insurance won't cover it, whatever. Keeps us off the water after dark.
3 weeks after that trip, I got an email from Brad. He'd been having nightmares, he said. Dreams about being underwater, surrounded by those glowing shapes. He wanted to know if I'd been having them too. I lied and told him no. But the truth is, I have the same dream almost every night. I'm floating in black water, and far below me, I can see that green glow getting brighter, rising up toward me. And just before I wake up, I see them. Dozens of those creatures, circling, watching, waiting. I'm thinking about selling the boat, maybe moving inland, maybe getting a job where I never have to see the ocean again. Because I know what Ray was talking about. We were allowed to leave that night. Those things, whatever they are, they let us go. But I can't shake the feeling that they're still there, still watching, still waiting. And I wonder sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, what would have happened if they'd decided not to let us leave? What would have happened if they'd been hungry instead of curious? I don't want to know the answer to that question, and I hope I never find out.
This next story comes from Jennifer Caldwell, a wildlife biologist from Minnesota. My name is Jennifer Caldwell, and I'm a wildlife biologist from Minnesota. I'm writing this because I need someone to know what I found in Lake Superior last fall, and because the official reports don't tell the whole story. They can't tell the whole story because nobody would believe it. I specialize in studying fish populations in the Great Lakes, specifically tracking the impact of invasive species on native fish. It's detailed work, often boring, but I love it, or at least I used to love it. Last October, I was conducting a routine survey on the north shore of Lake Superior, near the Canadian border. The area is remote, no real towns nearby, just forest and rocky coastline. I was working alone, which wasn't unusual. I had my research boat, my equipment, and a satellite phone in case of emergencies. The weather that week had been strange, unseasonably warm for October, with thick fog rolling in every evening that didn't burn off until late morning. The lake was calm, though, and my instruments were working fine, so I continued with my survey. I was using gill nets to catch sample fish. You set them in the evening, leave them overnight, and check them in the morning. It's standard practice. The fish swim into the net and get caught by their gills. It sounds cruel, but it's the most effective way to get accurate population data. On my third night out there, I set the nets around 7 p.m. in about 60 feet of water, roughly half a mile from shore. The fog was already rolling in as I motored back to my campsite on the beach. By the time I'd tied up the boat, I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. I made dinner on my camp stove, input the day's data into my laptop, and went to bed around 10 p.m. in my tent. The fog was so thick by then that it seemed to muffle all sound. No wind, no waves, just absolute silence. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something moving in the water. Not splashing, just displacement, like something large was surfacing nearby. I unzipped my tent and looked out toward the lake. The fog had lifted slightly, and there was enough starlight to see the outline of my boat about 30 yards away. But beyond it, out where I'd set my nets, I could see lights. Multiple lights moving beneath the surface of the water. My first thought was that someone else was out there, maybe another research vessel or commercial fisherman. But the lights were wrong. They weren't the bright white of boat lights or diving lights. These were softer, more diffuse, and they were moving in patterns that didn't make sense, spiraling around each other, diving deep and then rising quickly. I grabbed my flashlight and walked down to the water's edge. The lights were still there, and as I watched, they began moving toward shore, toward me. I should have been scared, but mostly I was curious. This was my job, after all, investigating strange phenomena in the lake. I waded into the shallows with my flashlight, trying to get a better look. The light stopped about 50 feet from shore, hovering just beneath the surface. I could see now that they weren't coming from any kind of equipment. They were bioluminescent, similar to jellyfish or certain types of plankton. But Lake Superior is a freshwater lake, and it's too cold for most bioluminescent organisms. As I stood there in the water, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, one of the lights detached from the others and moved closer. It rose toward the surface, and in my flashlight beam, I finally saw what was creating the glow. It was a fish. At least, it had been a fish once. It looked like a lake trout, maybe 20 pounds, but something was terribly wrong with it. Its scales were missing in patches, and where they should have been, there was exposed flesh that glowed with a pale blue light.
Its eyes were oversized and bulbous, like they'd been stretched, and its mouth was open in a permanent grimace, revealing teeth that were too long and too numerous. The fish floated at the surface for a moment, and I realized it wasn't swimming. It was just there, suspended in the water, glowing, watching me with those horrible, swollen eyes. Then it jerked suddenly and dove back down, rejoining the other lights. They all began moving again, this time heading back out toward deeper water. Within minutes, they disappeared completely. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat on the beach with my flashlight, watching the water, trying to convince myself that I'd seen some kind of natural phenomenon I just didn't understand yet. Maybe it was a bacterial infection that caused bioluminescence. Maybe it was some kind of parasite. There had to be a scientific explanation. When dawn finally came, I headed out to check my nets. The fog had returned, thicker than ever, but I knew these waters well enough to navigate by GPS. I found my first net easily enough. It was shredded. Not torn by a boat propeller or damaged by debris, shredded, like something had systematically destroyed it. Dozens of holes, each about the size of my fist, punched through the netting at regular intervals.
The second net was worse. Not only was it shredded, but it was covered in some kind of slime, thick, viscous, and faintly luminescent in the early morning light. And the smell, God, the smell, like rotting fish mixed with chemicals, similar to what Marcus described in his story, though I wouldn't know that until much later. The third net was gone entirely. Just the anchor weights remained, the net itself torn completely away. I pulled out what remained of the first two nets and examined them on the boat. The slime was unlike anything I had encountered before. I scraped some into sample jars for later analysis. The holes in the netting were precise, almost surgical. Whatever had made them had done so deliberately. That's when I noticed the fish. Caught in one of the torn sections of net was a walleye, maybe 5 pounds. But like the lake trout I'd seen the night before, something was wrong with it. Its scales were loose and peeling, its eyes were clouded, and there were lesions on its body that glowed faintly even in daylight. I was careful not to touch it directly. Using gloves and forceps, I freed it from the net and placed it in a sample bag.
It didn't struggle. In fact, I wasn't entirely sure it was alive, though it occasionally twitched in a way that suggested some kind of muscle activity. I decided to cut my survey short and head back to the research station, about 40 miles down the coast. Whatever was happening here, I needed proper laboratory equipment to investigate it. The trip back should have taken a couple of hours, but the fog was so thick I had to navigate almost entirely by GPS, moving slowly to avoid hitting rocks or logs. About halfway back, my depth finder started acting strangely. It was showing objects in the water column below me, large objects, moving in formation like a school of fish, but they were too big to be any fish species in Lake Superior. The largest showed up as maybe 15 feet long. I increased my speed, not wanting to find out what those readings represented. When I finally reached the research station, I immediately took my samples to the lab. The slime from the nets was bizarre under the microscope. It contained cells I couldn't identify, organic matter that didn't match any known species in the lake. The cellular structure was all wrong, like something had taken fish cells and corrupted them somehow. The walleye was even stranger. Its tissues were breaking down at an accelerated rate, decomposing even though parts of it still showed signs of life. Under UV light, the lesions on its body fluoresced intensely. I took tissue samples and sent them off for genetic analysis. The results came back 3 weeks later. The lab called me personally, which was unusual. The geneticist who done the analysis sounded confused and more than a little disturbed. "Jennifer, where exactly did you find this specimen?" she asked. "Lake Superior, North Shore." "Why?" "Because according to these results, this fish has genetic markers that don't exist in any known species, and there's evidence of something else in the tissues, something that looks almost like a prion disease, but more complex. Whatever this fish was exposed to, it fundamentally altered its biology." "What could do that?" "I have no idea. I've never seen anything like it. I'd like to send these samples to the CDC if you're willing. This might be important."
I agreed and sent her everything I had, but I never heard back from the CDC. After a few weeks of leaving messages that went unreturned, I contacted the lab again. The geneticist told me that government officials had confiscated all the samples and instructed her not to discuss the findings with anyone. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've tried to find out what's happening in that part of Lake Superior, but all my requests for information have been denied or ignored. The area where I was working is now restricted, officially for environmental testing, though no one will say what they're testing for. I've heard rumors, though, stories from local fishermen about strange catches, fish with deformities, entire sections of the lake where nothing bites anymore. And there was that incident last month where a fishing boat disappeared up near the Canadian border. They found it 3 days later, abandoned, the crew nowhere to be found. The official report said it was a case of carbon monoxide poisoning, and the crew likely fell overboard. But I've talked to people who saw the boat. They said it looked like something had tried to pull it underwater. The hull was covered in deep scratches and that same luminescent slime I'd found on my nets. I don't go out on Lake Superior anymore. I've requested a transfer to a different research area, somewhere far from the Great Lakes.
I tell people it's for career advancement, but the truth is, I can't stop thinking about those lights under the water, that corrupted fish staring at me with those bulging eyes, and those readings on my depth finder showing something massive moving beneath my boat. Something is in that lake, something that's changing the fish, something that shouldn't exist in those cold, dark waters. And whatever it is, I think it's spreading. I dream about it sometimes. I'm back in my boat, surrounded by fog, and the water around me is glowing with those blue lights. And in the dream, I always make the mistake of looking down, of looking through the hull into the water below. And I see them, hundreds of corrupted fish, all staring at me with those terrible eyes, their bodies pulsing with that alien light. I wake up sweating, my heart racing, and I check the news obsessively for reports from Lake Superior, terrified that I'll see confirmation of what I already know, that something unnatural is living in those depths, and it's only a matter of time before more people encounter it. Whatever's in Lake Superior, I don't think we're equipped to deal with it. I don't think we even understand what it is, and that terrifies me more than anything else.
This one's from Tommy Nguyen, who's been fishing the bayous of southern Louisiana his whole life. My name is Tommy Nguyen, and I'm 62 years old. I've been fishing the bayous of southern Louisiana my whole life, just like my father before me and his father before him. I know these waters like I know my own hands. Every channel, every cypress stand, every hidden spot where the big bass like to hide. Or at least, I thought I knew them. What happened to me last spring changed everything. I'm writing this down because my family thinks I'm losing my mind, and maybe I am, but I need someone to know that what I saw was real. Even if nobody believes me, I need to tell this story. I do a lot of my fishing alone these days. My wife passed 5 years ago. My kids have moved away to Baton Rouge and Houston, and most of my old fishing buddies have either died or gotten too old to spend long hours on the water. So it's just me and my flat-bottom boat, heading out into the swamp before dawn and coming back when the light starts to fade. I prefer it that way, honestly. The solitude, the quiet, just the sounds of the bayou. Birds calling, fish jumping, the wind moving through the Spanish moss. It's peaceful. Or it was peaceful, until that morning in April. I'd headed out around 5 a.m., wanting to reach a spot deep in the swamp where I'd had good luck catching tapfish the week before. It's about an hour from the boat launch, back in a section of the bayou where not many people go. The channels get narrow, choked with cypress knees and water plants, and you have to know the route or you'll get lost pretty quick. The sun was just starting to come up when I reached my spot, a wide pool surrounded by ancient cypress trees draped in moss. The water was dark, bayou water always is, but calm and mirror smooth. Perfect conditions. I cut the motor and let the boat drift while I set up my lines. I was using chicken liver for bait, which catfish love. I cast out 3 lines, set the rods and holders, and settled back with my thermos of coffee to wait. The first hour was normal. I caught 2 small catfish, nothing worth keeping, and threw them back. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. It was shaping up to be a hot day, the kind when the humidity makes the air feel thick as soup. Around 7:30, my middle rod bent sharply and the reel started clicking. I grabbed it and set the hook, expecting another catfish, but whatever I'd hooked was heavy and moving differently than a catfish. It wasn't running or fighting,
just pulling steadily toward the bottom with tremendous weight. My arms were starting to burn from the effort, and I was considering cutting the line when suddenly the tension released. The rod straightened, and I reeled in nothing but empty line. The hook was gone, not broken off, but missing entirely, like something had bitten clean through the heavy steel.
I was examining the frayed line when I noticed the water. It had gone completely still, no ripples, no movement at all. Even the insects that usually skated across the surface were gone. The birds had stopped calling. Everything was silent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. In 62 years of fishing these swamps, I'd learned to trust that feeling. When the bayou goes quiet like that, something's wrong. I started the motor, ready to leave, when I saw the water about 20 feet from my boat begin to swirl. Not like something had surfaced, more like it was being drained from below, creating a slow spiral that grew wider and wider. Then the smell hit me, rot and decay, like something that had been dead for weeks in the Louisiana heat. It was so strong I had to cover my nose and mouth with my shirt. The spiral in the water kept growing, and I could see now that the water in the center of it was turning darker, almost black. And rising up from that darkness was something I still don't have words for. It looked at first like a massive tree root, gnarled and twisted, covered in what looked like moss or maybe fungus. But as more of it emerged, I realized it was moving with purpose, undulating like a snake or tentacle. It was as thick as my leg and just kept coming up, 10 feet, 15 feet, curling up into the air above the water. Then another one emerged next to it, and another. Within seconds, there were 5 of these things rising from the water, swaying gently like they were tasting the air. And at the base where they emerged from the black water, I could see something else, a shape massive and indistinct just beneath the surface. I sat frozen in my boat, hand still on the motor, unable to move or think clearly. The appendages, I don't know what else to call them, began reaching outward, stretching toward the cypress trees around the pool. When they touched the bark, I heard a sound like sizzling, and the trees began to wither. The bark turned black and started sloughing off. The leaves turned brown and fell. One of the appendages swung toward my boat. I could see now that its surface wasn't smooth. It was covered in what looked like suckers or mouths, hundreds of them, opening and closing rhythmically. Some of them had teeth. That broke my paralysis. I yanked the motor's pull cord, but it didn't catch. I tried again and again, the appendage getting closer with each failed attempt. I could hear those mouths now, making a wet clicking sound that turned my stomach. On the 4th pull, the motor roared to life. I threw it in reverse and backed away from that thing as fast as the boat would go, not caring that I was backing blind into the narrow channels. I just needed distance. The appendages didn't follow me. They stayed in that pool, continuing their work on the cypress trees. I watched over my shoulder as I retreated, and I saw something that I wish I could forget. The thing beneath the water was rising up, breaking the surface, and it was huge. I couldn't see all of it, just sections, a bulk that seemed to fill the entire pool, covered in that same root-like texture, with those appendages emerging from it like the arms of some massive, corrupted octopus. And then I was around a bend and couldn't see it anymore. I didn't slow down. I navigated those narrow channels faster than I'd ever dared, scraping the boat on cypress knees, tearing through water plants, not caring about anything except getting away from that place. When I finally reached the boat launch, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely tie up the boat. The attendant, a young guy named Marcus who worked there most days, came over to help. "You okay, Mr. Tommy? You look like you seen a ghost." I wanted to tell him what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. How do you describe something like that? How do you make someone understand that there's something in the bayou that shouldn't exist? Something that can kill century-old cypress trees with a touch? "I'm fine," I finally managed. "Just had a scare with a gator." He nodded, accepting this explanation, and helped me load my gear into my truck. I drove home in a daze. My wife's sister was visiting, and she took one look at me and insisted on making tea, fussing over me like I was sick. I let her, grateful for the normalcy of it, the ordinary human kindness that helped ground me after what I'd witnessed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those appendages, hearing that clicking sound. Around 2 a.m., I got up and searched online for any reports of strange things in the Louisiana swamps. I found plenty of stories about alligators, snakes, even the occasional legend about a rougarou or other cryptid, but nothing like what I'd seen. I did find something else, though. A news article from 1987 about a section of the bayou that had been mysteriously dying. All the fish gone, the trees withering, the water turning black. Environmental officials had investigated and blamed it on chemical dumping, though they never found the source. The location mentioned in the article was only about 5 miles from where I'd been fishing. The article said the die-off had stopped as mysteriously as it started, and the area had recovered over the following years. But what if it hadn't stopped? What if it had just moved? Over the next few weeks, I made calls to the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, trying to report what I had seen without sounding crazy. I described it as a possible invasive species or maybe toxic algae. They took my information and said they'd send someone to investigate, but I never heard back. I drove out to the boat launch a few times, but I couldn't bring myself to go back out on the water. Marcus told me that a couple of other fishermen had reported equipment failures and strange smells in the same area where I had been. One of them said he'd seen what looked like dead fish floating in huge numbers, thousands of them, all in one spot. Then about 6 weeks after my encounter, I saw a notice posted at the boat launch. The area where I had been fishing was being closed indefinitely due to environmental concerns. No further explanation was given. The notice was signed by some federal agency I'd never heard of. I tried to find out more, but no one would tell me anything. The few times I managed to get someone on the phone, they'd say they couldn't discuss an ongoing investigation and would hang up. Last month, I was at the grocery store when I ran into an old friend, Pierre, who still works for the parish. We got to talking, and I carefully brought up the closed section of the bayou. Pierre looked around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned in close. "Between you and me, Tommy, stay away from there. Way I heard it, they found something in the water they can't identify."
Something that's killing everything it touches. They got scientists in hazmat suits taking samples, military supervising the whole thing. Whatever it is, it ain't natural.
"What do they think it is?"
Pierre shrugged. "Nobody knows, but I heard one of the scientists say it's like nothing in any database, like it don't belong on Earth, you know." I knew exactly what he meant. I haven't been fishing since then. I sold my boat last week to a young couple from Mississippi who wanted to explore the bayou. I didn't tell them why I was selling it. Maybe I should have. But what would I say? That there's something in the water that looks like it crawled out of a nightmare? That the bayou I've known my whole life isn't safe anymore? My daughter called yesterday and says she's worried about me. Says I seem depressed, withdrawn. She wants me to see a doctor, maybe talk to someone. I told her I'm fine, just getting old, slowing down. But the truth is, I'm terrified. I'm terrified because I know that thing is still out there, somewhere in the miles of interconnected bayous and swamps. I'm terrified because whatever it is, it's spreading, killing everything it touches. And I'm terrified because nobody in authority seems to be able to stop it or even willing to admit what it is. Sometimes late at night, I stand on my back porch and listen to the sounds drifting up from the bayou, the frogs, the insects, the night birds, and I wonder how long before those sounds stop. How long before that black water and those terrible appendages reach this far? How long before whatever's out there in the swamp decides to come closer to civilization? I dream about it almost every night now. I'm back in my boat, but this time I can't start the motor. Those appendages are reaching for me, those hundreds of mouths clicking and gnashing. And in the dream, I always look down into the black water and see the thing those appendages are attached to, see its true form. And it's so wrong, so completely alien, that even in the dream my mind can't process it. I wake up gasping, and sometimes it takes hours before my heart stops pounding. The bayou raised me. It fed my family for generations. It's part of who I am, but I can't go back there now. Whatever's in those waters, it's changed everything. The place I loved, the place I thought I knew better than anywhere else on earth, has become something I don't recognize anymore. And the worst part? I think it's just the beginning. I think whatever I saw that morning in April is spreading, growing, consuming, and I don't think anyone knows how to stop it.
Here's another account from David Kowalski, a commercial fisherman from Alaska. My name is David Kowalski, and I'm a commercial fisherman from Alaska. I've been working the waters off the coast of Kodiak Island for 34 years, running a salmon boat during the season and doing some crabbing in the winter. It's hard work, dangerous work, but it's honest and it pays the bills. At least, it used to. I'm telling this story because I can't fish anymore. Not because I'm injured or too old, but because of what I saw out there last November. My crew won't talk about it. My wife thinks I should just forget it and move on. But I can't forget. And I think people need to know what's out there in those deep waters. It was late November, near the end of crab season. I had a crew of 4. My nephew Jake, 2 guys I'd worked with for years named Rick and Tom, and a new kid named Brandon who was working his first season. We'd been out for 3 days, pulling pots and having decent luck. The weather had been cold but manageable, seas running about 6 feet, nothing we couldn't handle. On our 4th night out, we were working about 40 miles offshore in about 300 feet of water. It was around 2 a.m., and we were hauling in our last string of pots before heading back to port. The temperature had dropped significantly, and ice was starting to form on the railings and equipment. Common enough for that time of year, but it meant we needed to work fast and get back before the ice got too heavy. Rick and Tom were on the hydraulic system, hauling up the pots, and Jake and Brandon were sorting the crabs as they came up, keeping the legal ones and throwing back the females and undersized males. I was in the wheelhouse, monitoring everything and keeping the boat positioned properly. The first few pots came up normal. Good catch, nice-sized crabs, exactly what we wanted to see. But the fourth pot looked strange as it broke the surface. Instead of the usual mass of crabs, there was just one thing in it, something big. "What the hell is that?" I heard Rick say over the radio. I came out of the wheelhouse to look. They'd swung the pot onto the deck and we all gathered around it. Inside was what looked like a crab, but wrong. It was huge, maybe twice the size of the biggest king crab I'd ever seen, and its shell was pale, almost white, with dark veins running through it like cracks. Its legs were too long and too thin, and they were moving slowly, deliberately, even though the thing had been pulled up from 300 feet and should have been sluggish from the pressure change. I said, "Don't open the pot," though I'm not sure why. Something about it just felt wrong. But Jake had already started undoing the door. "Come on, Uncle Dave, it's just a big crab, probably some kind of mutation or—" The thing moved fast. One of those two long legs shot out through the partially opened door and grabbed Jake's wrist. He screamed and tried to pull away, but the leg held tight. I could see it squeezing, the sharp end of it digging into his skin. Tom grabbed a gaff and hit the leg, trying to break its grip. But the leg released him, not because of the blow. It released him because the entire creature was now pushing its way out of the pot. As it emerged fully, I realized this wasn't any kind of crab I'd ever seen. Its body was all wrong, too segmented, too angular, and its shell, up close, wasn't just pale. It was translucent in places, and I could see things moving underneath it. Not organs, things, like there were smaller creatures living inside it. The crab thing scuttled across the deck with unnatural speed and went straight for the sorting table where we'd piled the regular crabs from the previous pots. We watched in horror as it attacked them, its mandibles, which were far too large and had too many joints, tearing into their shells. But it wasn't eating them. It was doing something else, something that looked almost like it was injecting them with something. "Get it off my boat!" I shouted. "Push it overboard, now!"
Rick grabbed a shovel and tried to push the thing toward the rail, but it turned on him. It reared up on its back legs, standing almost 3 feet tall, and I saw its underside. It was covered in what looked like lamprey mouths, circular and ringed with teeth, all of them opening and closing. Brandon, to his credit, didn't hesitate. He grabbed the fire hose we kept on deck and blasted the thing with seawater. The pressure knocked it backward, and Tom used a pike pole to push it the rest of the way to the rail and over the side. We heard the splash as it hit the water, and then it was gone. We stood there on the deck, breathing hard, not speaking. Jake was holding his wrist where the thing had grabbed him. There was a ring of puncture wounds, already turning dark purple. "What the fuck was that?" Brandon finally asked. I didn't have an answer. In 3 decades of fishing these waters, pulling up thousands of pots, I'd never seen anything like it. "Check the rest of the crabs. Make sure they're all normal." The guys spread out the pile of crabs from the earlier pots, examining each one. At first, they all looked fine, but then Rick called out, "Dave, you need to see this." One of the crabs, a normal-sized king crab that had been alive and healthy when we'd put it on the sorting table, was now dead, and its shell was changing. The same pale color was spreading across it, and those dark vein-like cracks were appearing. As we watched, the crab twitched. Then it started moving, even though it was clearly dead. Its legs moved stiffly, mechanically, and it started walking toward the other crabs. "Off the boat," I said. "All of them. Throw them all overboard. But Dave, that's 300 pounds of crab. Now, throw them all over right now. My tone left no room for argument. The crew started grabbing crabs and throwing them overboard as fast as they could, even the ones that looked normal. I wasn't taking any chances. When the deck was clear, I told everyone to wash down with bleach solution, especially Jake with his injured wrist. Then I got on the radio. I tried calling the Coast Guard first, but I couldn't figure out how to explain what had happened without sounding insane. I finally settled on reporting that we'd pulled up some kind of contaminated marine life and one crew member had been injured. They told us to head back to port immediately and report to the harbor master. The trip back took 6 hours. During that time, Jake started feeling sick. He was running a fever and the puncture wounds on his wrist were swelling. By the time we reached port, he could barely stand. The harbor master met us at the dock, along with 2 people in what looked like hazmat suits. They took Jake straight to the hospital and quarantined the rest of us on the boat while they examined the deck and equipment. They questioned us extensively about what we'd pulled up, but I could tell they didn't believe us. They probably thought we'd gotten into some chemical contamination or maybe radiation from a military dump site. They took samples of everything: the deck, the water, our clothes, even our blood. Jake spent 3 days in the hospital. The infection in his arm was resistant to every antibiotic they tried. Eventually, it cleared up on its own, but the scars from those puncture wounds are still there, and he says they ache sometimes, especially at night. We were finally released and told not to discuss what had happened with anyone. The official report said we'd encountered biological matter of unknown origin, and that the area where we had been fishing was being monitored. They wouldn't tell us anything else.
But I did some research on my own. I found reports going back decades of fishermen in the Bering Sea and around Alaska pulling up strange catches, deformed fish, crustaceans with unusual characteristics, even claims of creatures that didn't match any known species. Most of these reports were dismissed or explained away as misidentifications or hoaxes, but I also found something else. There are areas of the ocean floor around Alaska that have never been properly mapped or explored. Trenches that go down thousands of feet into complete darkness. And there have been unusual readings from some of these areas. Temperature anomalies, strange sonar returns, even occasional reports of lights in the deep water. What if those trenches harbor things we don't know about? What if some of them are coming up into shallower water, into areas where we fish? 2 weeks after our encounter, I heard from another fishing captain I knew. He'd pulled up something similar, though he was vague about the details. His boat had been quarantined too, his catch destroyed. He told me he was selling his boat and getting out of fishing entirely. "It's not worth it, Dave," he said. "Whatever's down there, it's changing things. The crab, the fish, maybe even the water itself. I've been fishing these waters for 40 years, and I'm telling you, something's wrong. Something's different now." I wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but I couldn't, because I'd seen it too. That thing in our pot, the way it moved, the way it infected the other crabs, that wasn't natural. That was something else entirely. Jake won't go back out on the boat. I don't blame him. Rick and Tom finished out the season with me, but they've both said they're looking for work on land now. Brandon left Alaska entirely. I heard he moved back to Oregon and got a job at a grocery store. I've tried to keep fishing, I really have. It's all I know how to do. But every time I pull up a pot, I'm terrified of what might be inside. Every shadow in the water, every unusual reading on the sonar makes my heart race. I can't eat crab anymore. Can't even look at it without feeling sick.
Last month I listed my boat for sale. It's been in my family for 2 generations, and selling it feels like giving up part of myself. But I can't do this anymore. I can't go out there knowing what's in those waters. The official position is that there's nothing to worry about, that whatever we encountered was an isolated incident. But I know better. I've talked to too many other fishermen who've seen things, who've pulled up catches that weren't right, who've noticed changes in the waters they've worked their whole lives. Something is happening in the North Pacific. Something's changing down in those deep trenches where light never reaches. And whatever it is, it's starting to come up. I dream about it sometimes. I'm back on my boat, pulling up a pot, and when it breaks the surface, it's full of those pale things with the wrong number of legs and the lamprey mouths. In the dream, they pour out of the pot like water, covering the deck, covering my crew, covering me, and I can feel them burrowing, injecting, changing. I wake up gasping, my heart pounding, and I have to remind myself that I'm in my bed, in my house, far from the ocean. But even here, 40 miles inland, I don't feel safe, because I know those things are still out there, still in those deep waters, still changing whatever they touch. And I wonder how long before they spread to other areas, how long before more fishermen encounter them, how long before whatever's happening in those trenches affects the entire ocean. The sea has always been dangerous. I've known that since I was a kid. But it was a danger you could understand. Storms, waves, cold, equipment failure. This is different. This is something we can't fight, can't predict, can't even properly comprehend. I'm 61 years old, and I've spent most of my life on the water. But I'm done now. I'm done because I've seen what's down there, and I know we're not equipped to deal with it. We're not prepared for what's coming up from those depths. The ocean is vast and deep, and we've barely explored even a fraction of it. We'd tell ourselves we know what's down there, that we've cataloged the life in our seas, but we haven't. We don't know. And what we don't know is far more terrifying than anything we've imagined. God help us all if those things decide to come up in larger numbers. God help us if they spread beyond the deep waters, because I don't think we have any way to stop them.
Story comes from Elena Vasquez, a fishing guide in the Florida Everglades. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I'm a fishing guide in the Florida Everglades. I've been doing this work for 18 years, taking tourists and serious anglers out into the backcountry to fish for snook, redfish, and tarpon. I love my job, or I did, until what happened last February made me question everything I thought I knew about these waters. I'm a 4th-generation Floridian. My great-grandfather was a Miccosukee Indian who taught my grandfather how to navigate the glades, and that knowledge was passed down to me. I know every channel, every mangrove island, every subtle current in these waters. The Everglades is my home, my livelihood, and my passion. Or it was. Last February, I had a client named Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a marine biologist from Boston, who wanted to study the ecosystem and do some fishing while she was at it. She was a pleasant woman, early 50s, enthusiastic about the environment and respectful of the land, the kind of client I enjoyed working with. We headed out early on a Tuesday morning, the air still cool and misty. I took her deep into the backcountry, to an area where the sawgrass gives way to mangrove channels and the water turns from murky brown to clear green. It's remote, quiet, and usually full of fish. We fished for a few hours with decent success. A couple of nice snook, some jacks, a small tarpon that Patricia was thrilled to catch and release. Around noon, we stopped for lunch on a small island barely big enough for my boat and a few mangrove trees. Patricia was eating her sandwich when she noticed something in the water. "Elena, what's that?" I looked where she was pointing. About 30 feet from our boat, the water was discolored. Not the usual brown or green, but a strange grayish color that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. "Probably just stirred up sediment," I said, though I'd never seen sediment that color before. We watched it for a few minutes. The discolored patch wasn't moving with the current like sediment should. It was staying in one place, slowly expanding. Patricia, being a scientist, wanted to get a sample. She pulled out a small collection kit from her bag. She always carried one, she'd told me earlier, just in case she saw something interesting. "I wouldn't," I said. That old instinct from my grandfather kicking in. He always taught me to respect things in the glades that seem unusual, to give them space. But Patricia was already leaning over the side of the boat with a sample jar, reaching toward the discolored water. "It's fine. I've done this 1,000 times. I just want to see what's causing the color change." She dipped the jar into the water at the edge of the gray patch. The moment the jar made contact, the water around it began to move, not like a fish or current. It moved with purpose, flowing toward the jar like it was being drawn to it. Patricia yelped and pulled the jar back. It was half full of the gray fluid, which now looked more like a thick fluid than water, and it was moving inside the jar, swirling in patterns that didn't follow physics as I understood it. "Put it down," I said quietly. "Put the jar down right now." She set it on the boat deck, and we both stared at it. The gray fluid was still moving, and now I could see things in it. Small particles or maybe organisms. I couldn't tell which. They were pulsing with a faint light, like tiny bioluminescent creatures, but the light was wrong. It was a sickly yellow-green color that hurt to look at. "This is remarkable," Patricia whispered. "I've never seen anything like this. It could be some kind of bacterial bloom, or maybe a new species of—" The jar cracked. Just a small crack at first, running up from the bottom. Then another crack, and another. Within seconds, the jar shattered, and the gray fluid spilled out onto the deck. I expected it to just pool there, but it didn't. It moved across the deck like it was alive, spreading out in thin tendrils that reached toward the sides of the boat, toward the water. "Get away from it!" I shouted, pulling Patricia back toward the console.
We watched as the fluid reached the edge of the deck and dripped back into the water. Where it entered, the gray patch expanded rapidly, doubling in size within seconds. And then the fish started coming up. They surfaced all around us. Snook, snappers, small sharks, even a manatee. But they weren't coming up to breathe or feed. They were dead or dying, their bodies convulsing as they floated in that gray water. And their skin, their skin was changing, turning gray, developing those same faint veins of yellow-green light. "Start the engine," Patricia said, her voice shaking. "We need to leave, now." I was already reaching for the ignition. The engine turned over, but died immediately. I tried again. Same result. The battery was fine, the fuel was fine, but the engine wouldn't catch. The water, Patricia said, pointing. The gray patch had spread beneath our boat. We were floating in it now, surrounded by it, and I could feel the boat starting to settle lower in the water, like it was getting heavier. I looked over the side and saw why. The hull was covered in a gray film, and where the film touched, the fiberglass was deteriorating, literally dissolving, small pieces flaking off and sinking into that strange water. "We need to call for help," I said, reaching for my radio. But when I pressed the transmit button, nothing happened. The radio was dead. So was my cell phone. So was the GPS. Every piece of electronic equipment on the boat had stopped working. Patricia was looking at her hands. "Elena, my hands!" The skin on her hands, where she'd held the sample jar, was turning gray. Just slightly, just at the fingertips, but it was definitely changing color. And she was scratching at them, saying they itched, they burned. I grabbed a bottle of fresh water and poured it over her hands, trying to wash away whatever was affecting them. It didn't help. If anything, the discoloration was spreading up her fingers. The boat was settling faster now. Water was starting to come over the sides as the hull was dissolving beneath us. We had maybe a few minutes before we sank completely. "We have to swim," I said. "We have to get out of this gray water and swim for that island." I pointed to a mangrove island maybe 100 yards away. It was visible through the channels beyond the edge of the gray patch. "We can't swim through that," Patricia said, looking at the water that was now lapping at our feet on the deck. "Look what it's doing to the boat. Look what it's doing to my hands." She was right. Swimming through that water would be suicide, but staying on the boat meant drowning when it sank. I looked around desperately for options. The gray patch extended about 50 feet in every direction from us, and beyond that, the water looked normal. If we could just get beyond the edge. That's when I remembered the push-pole. Every guide boat in the Everglades carries a long fiberglass pole for pushing through shallow water. Mine was still secured to the side of the boat. I grabbed it and started pushing against the bottom. We were in about 4 feet of water, shallow enough to reach. The pole bit into the muddy bottom, and I pushed with everything I had. The boat moved. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, but it moved, away from the center of the gray patch, toward the edge.
Patricia grabbed the spare pole and helped push from the other side. Her hands were completely gray now, up to her wrists, and I could see her grimacing in pain. But she kept pushing. It took us 20 minutes to push that boat 50 feet. 20 minutes of the hull continuing to dissolve beneath us, water rising around our ankles. That gray film spreading across every surface it touched. But finally, we crossed the edge of the patch into normal water. The change was immediate. The boat stopped settling. The water on the deck stopped moving in those unnatural patterns. We could breathe again without feeling like the air itself was wrong. I tried the engine again, and this time it caught. I opened the throttle and got us away from that area as fast as the damaged boat would carry us. I didn't slow down until we were 2 miles away, back in waters I recognized, waters that looked and felt normal. Patricia's hands had stopped turning gray, but the damage was done. Her skin was discolored up to her elbows, rough and hardened like scar tissue. She said she couldn't feel her fingers anymore, couldn't feel anything below her wrists. We made it back to the launch ramp, and I drove her straight to the emergency room. The doctors didn't know what to make of her condition. They treated it as a chemical burn, but nothing they did seemed to help. They took samples of her skin and sent them off for analysis. Meanwhile, I reported what had happened to the Park Service, to the Environmental Protection Agency, to anyone who would listen. I took them to the location where we'd encountered the gray water, But there was no sign of it. The water looked normal. The fish were swimming normally. It was like nothing had happened. They sent divers down to examine my boat hull. The damage was real. Significant deterioration of the fiberglass consistent with chemical exposure. But they couldn't find any trace of what had caused it in the water samples they took. Patricia's skin samples came back inconclusive. The tissue was damaged at a cellular level, they said, but they couldn't determine what had caused it. It wasn't bacterial, viral, fungal, or consistent with any known chemical agent. She went back to Boston a week later. She emails me sometimes. The discoloration in her skin has faded somewhat, but she still has no feeling in her hands. She had to give up her field work. She teaches now, but she can't do the hands-on research she loved. I tried to go back to work, to keep guiding, but I couldn't. Every patch of discolored water, every unusual current, every shadow beneath the surface made my heart race. I started having panic attacks on the water. After 2 months of trying to push through it, I finally admitted I couldn't do it anymore. I sold my boat, what was left of it after the repairs, and I stopped guiding. Now I work at a tackle shop in Homestead. It's indoor work, safe work, but it's not the same. The Everglades was my life, and I can't go back. Because I know what I saw out there. I know that gray water was something unnatural, something that shouldn't exist in these ecosystems. And I know it's still out there somewhere, waiting. I've heard reports since then, though they never make the news. Other guides talking quietly about strange patches of water, fish dying for no apparent reason, equipment failing in specific locations. The Park Service denies anything unusual is happening, says the Everglades is healthy and thriving, but I know better. Whatever that gray water was, wherever it came from, it's still in the glades. Maybe it's spreading. Maybe it's dormant. Maybe it's something that comes and goes, appearing in different locations, affecting different areas before disappearing again. Patricia thinks it might be some kind of organism we've never encountered before, something from deep underground that's seeping up through the limestone. She's written papers about it, though no one takes them seriously without physical evidence. And all our evidence, the sample jar, the boat hull, her damaged hands, has been explained away as exposure to agricultural runoff or industrial chemicals. But I was there. I saw how that water moved, how it sought out organic material, how it changed everything it touched. That wasn't pollution. That was something alive, something intelligent in its own alien way, something that doesn't belong in our world. I still dream about it. I'm back in my boat, surrounded by that gray water, watching it spread and spread until the entire Everglades turns that terrible color. In the dream, I can see beneath the surface, see what's really in that water, see the source of it, and it's so vast, so incomprehensibly wrong that even in the dream I can't look at it directly. I wake up with Patricia's words echoing in my mind, something she said to me right before she left Florida. What if it's not from here at all? What if it's something that's been here all along, buried deep, and we finally disturbed it? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if I want to know the answer. All I know is that the Everglades I loved, the place I called home, isn't safe anymore. Maybe it never was. Maybe we've just been lucky until now, fishing those waters without knowing what lies beneath. But our luck is running out. I can feel it. And when I hear about strange catches, about fish with deformities, about entire sections of the glades that have gone silent and empty, I wonder if we're already too late. If whatever's down there is already spreading beyond the point where we can stop it. The Everglades is called the River of Grass, a slow-moving sheet of water flowing from Lake Okeechobee to the Gulf of Mexico. But I think there's another river beneath it, one we can't see, one that flows through cracks in the limestone bedrock. And in that dark river, in that water that's never seen sunlight, something lives, something that's starting to seep up into our world. God help us when it finally breaks through completely. God help us all.
Story 6 comes from Richard Rick Patterson. My name is Richard Rick Patterson, and I'm a retired high school teacher from Portland, Oregon. I took up fly fishing about 15 years ago, after my wife suggested I needed a hobby that would get me outdoors and away from grading papers. I fell in love with it, the patience it requires, the skill, the quiet solitude of standing in a river with nothing but the sound of water and birds around you. I mostly fish the rivers and streams in the Cascade Mountains, beautiful cold water streams full of trout. It's peaceful work, meditative. Or it was, until last September, when I decided to try a new spot that a fellow fisherman had told me about. The place was called Whisper Creek, a tributary that fed into the Clackamas River about 60 miles east of Portland. According to my friend Tom, it was relatively unknown, hard to access, but absolutely full of native cutthroat trout. He'd fished it once, about 10 years ago, and said it was the best fishing he'd ever experienced. He gave me detailed directions, the logging road to take, where to park, the trail that led down to the creek. Just be careful, he'd said. The trail's pretty overgrown. I haven't been back since that one time, but the fishing was worth the hike. I asked him why he'd never gone back if it was so good, but he just shrugged and said something about it being too far from town. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I headed out on a Thursday morning in early September. The weather forecast was perfect, clear skies, temperatures in the low 70s. I packed my gear, made some sandwiches, filled my water bottles, and drove out into the mountains. Finding the logging road was easy enough, though it was in rough shape, barely maintained. My Subaru handled it fine, and after about 45 minutes of bumping along, I reached the area Tom had described. There was a small pullout, just barely big enough for one vehicle, and what looked like the remnants of a trail leading into the forest. I geared up, strapped on my waders, assembled my fly rod, and headed down the trail. Tom was right about it being overgrown. Blackberry bushes encroached from both sides, and fallen logs blocked the path in several places. It took me nearly an hour to hike what couldn't have been more than half a mile. But when I finally broke through the undergrowth and saw the creek, I understood why Tom had been so enthusiastic. It was beautiful. A clear mountain stream, maybe 30 feet wide, flowing over rounded stones and creating perfect pools and riffles. The water was so clear I could see the bottom, see the shapes of fish holding in the current. The forest around the creek was old growth, massive Douglas firs and cedars that must have been hundreds of years old, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft green patterns on the water.
It was like stepping into another world, a place that time had forgotten. I spent a few minutes just standing there, taking it in. Then I tied on a fly, a small elk hair caddis that usually worked well on mountain streams, and started fishing. The first cast brought a strike, a beautiful 12-inch cutthroat, its sides marked with the distinctive red slash that gives the species its name. I brought it to hand, admired it briefly, and released it back into the water. Over the next hour, I caught and released maybe a dozen fish. Tom hadn't exaggerated. This was exceptional fishing. I worked my way upstream, casting to likely spots, catching fish after fish. I was so focused on the fishing that I didn't notice how the forest had grown quieter. The birds that had been singing when I arrived had gone silent. Even the insects seemed to have disappeared. It was around noon when I reached a section of the creek where it widened into a deep pool, maybe 50 feet across and dark enough that I couldn't see the bottom. The water entering the pool came from a small waterfall, perhaps 6 feet high, where the creek tumbled over a ledge of basalt rock. I stood at the edge of the pool, debating whether to fish it or eat lunch first. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, easily dismissed as decaying vegetation, or maybe a dead animal somewhere in the forest. But as I stood there, it grew stronger, a rotten, organic smell that made my stomach turn. I looked around, trying to find the source, and that's when I saw them. Fish. Dead fish, scattered along the banks of the pool. Not just one or two, but dozens of them. Cutthroat trout, most of them larger than anything I'd caught that morning, lying in various stages of decay.
That was strange enough, but what really disturbed me was how they died. They weren't just dead. They looked like they'd been torn apart. Pieces were missing. And the pieces that remained showed something I couldn't quite identify. The flesh looked almost melted in places, like it had been partially dissolved. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and hike back to my car. But I've always been cursed with curiosity, that need to understand things that don't make sense. So, instead of leaving, I moved closer to examine one of the fish. It was a large cutthroat, maybe 18 inches, and it hadn't been dead long, maybe a day or two at most. But the damage to it was extensive. Its belly had been opened, not cleanly like a predator would do, but raggedly, like something had forced its way inside. And the edges of the wound had that same melted appearance I'd noticed on the others. I was crouched down, looking at the fish, when I heard a splash. Not a small splash like jumping fish, but a large displacement of water, like something big had just surfaced in the middle of the pool. I stood up quickly and looked out at the water. The surface was rippling, circles spreading out from a point about 20 feet from shore. But I couldn't see what had made the splash. The water was too dark, too deep. Then I saw movement beneath the surface, something pale, something large, moving through the water in a way that didn't match any fish I knew. It was undulating, serpentine, but it wasn't an eel or a snake. It was too thick, too substantial. The thing surfaced briefly, just for a second, and I caught a glimpse of it. It looked like a mass of flesh, pale and textured like raw meat, with what might have been appendages or tendrils extending from it. I couldn't make out any distinct features, couldn't tell if it had eyes or a mouth or anything that would identify it as a recognizable creature. Then it was gone again, diving back into the depths of the pool. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. What the hell was that? Some kind of deformed fish? A mutation? But it hadn't moved like a fish. It had moved with purpose, with an intelligence that felt wrong. The water in the pool started to churn, not violently, but enough that I could see something was moving down there, something that was disturbing a lot of water. And the smell was getting stronger, that rotten organic stench that was now so powerful I had to breathe through my mouth. That's when I noticed the water itself was changing. Near the center of the pool, where the thing had surfaced, the water was taking on a milky appearance. Not like sediment stirred up from the bottom. This was different. It looked almost like the water was curdling, becoming thicker, more viscous. The milky patch spread quickly, and as it reached the edges of the pool, I saw fish, live fish, swimming frantically away from that contaminated water. They were leaping out of the water, throwing themselves onto the rocks, doing anything to escape that contaminated water. One fish didn't make it. A cutthroat, about 14 inches long, swimming desperately toward the shallows, got caught in the milky water. I watched it as it convulsed, its body twisting in ways that fish bodies shouldn't twist. Within seconds, it went still and floated to the surface, dead. But it didn't stay dead. Even as I watched, its body began to change. The scales sloughed off, revealing flesh that was turning pale and starting to dissolve. And something was moving inside, something that was consuming it from within.
I backed away from the pool, my fly rod forgotten in my hand. This wasn't natural. This was wrong on a fundamental level that my brain struggled to process. The milky water had spread to cover most of the pool now, and the churning beneath the surface was intensifying. I could see shapes down there, multiple shapes, moving in coordinated patterns. There wasn't just one of those things. There were several, maybe many, and they were coming toward shore, toward me. I didn't wait to see what would happen when they reached land. I turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, not caring about the blackberry thorns tearing at my waders, not caring about the branches whipping my face. I just ran, driven by a primal fear that overrode every other thought. Behind me, I heard splashing, lots of splashing, like things were emerging from the water. And I heard something else, a sound I still can't adequately describe. It was wet and organic, like meat being torn, but there was also a clicking quality to it, almost like communication. I didn't look back. I kept running, following the overgrown trail as best I could, sometimes losing it and having to bushwhack through the forest. My lungs were burning, my legs were screaming, but I didn't slow down. At some point, I don't know how long I'd been running, I realized I couldn't hear the sounds behind me anymore. I stopped, gasping for breath, and listened. Just forest sounds. Birds were singing again, which somehow made me feel slightly better. Whatever those things were, they apparently didn't venture far from the water. It took me another 45 minutes to reach my car, and by the time I got there, I was exhausted, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my keys out of my pocket. I threw my gear in the back seat, not bothering to break down my rod or even take off my waders. I just wanted to leave. I drove back down that logging road faster than was safe, my Subaru bouncing over ruts and rocks, not caring if I damaged the suspension. I didn't feel safe until I was back on the paved highway, heading toward Portland. That night, I tried to research what I'd seen. I searched online for reports of unusual creatures in Oregon streams, for fish diseases that could cause the kind of changes I'd witnessed, for anything that might explain it. I found nothing that came close. I did find something interesting, though. The area around Whisper Creek had been logged heavily in the 1950s, but before that, it had been off-limits. The local Native American tribes, I believe it was the Molalla people, had considered it sacred ground, but not in a positive way. It was a place to be avoided, a place where, according to their oral traditions, something unclean lived in the water. There were also reports from early white settlers in the region, mentions in old letters and journals about a creek in that area where animals refused to drink and where fish caught there tasted wrong and made people sick. But these were just fragments, scattered references that had been mostly forgotten. I tried calling Tom, wanting to ask him if he'd seen anything unusual when he fished there 10 years ago. His wife answered and told me Tom had passed away the previous year. Cancer, she said. It had started in his stomach and spread quickly. I wanted to ask her if Tom had eaten any fish from Whisper Creek, but I couldn't figure out how to phrase the question without sounding insane. So I just offered my condolences and hung up. 2 weeks after my experience, I drove back out to that area. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to confirm it had really happened, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I parked at the same pullout and hiked down the trail to the creek. The forest was silent again, that same oppressive silence I'd noticed before. When I reached the creek, I stayed well back from the water's edge. The dead fish on the banks had rotten down to bones. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, watching the water, looking for any sign of what I'd seen. Nothing moved. The water was clear and cold and looked perfectly normal. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought it was an ideal place to fish. But I did know better. I knew what was in that pool, down in the depths where the light didn't reach. Those pale things, those masses of corrupted flesh that consumed and changed whatever they touched. They were still there, waiting.
I haven't been back since. I still fly fish, but I stick to well-known streams now. Places with lots of other anglers, places where I'm never alone with the water.
My wife asks sometimes why I don't go out as much as I used to, why I seem nervous on the rare occasions when I do fish. I tell her I'm just getting older, slowing down. It's easier than trying to explain the truth. Because how do you explain that you've seen something that shouldn't exist? How do you tell someone that there are places in these mountains where the water itself has been corrupted by something ancient and hungry? How do you make them understand that we share these forests with things that were here long before us and will be here long after we're gone? I think about those Native American stories, those warnings about unclean water. They knew. Their ancestors had encountered whatever lives in Whisper Creek, and they passed down the knowledge through generations. But we didn't listen. We dismissed their stories as superstition, as primitive beliefs that had no place in our modern scientific world. But I know now that they were right. There are places in this world that should be left alone, places where the natural order has been twisted into something wrong, and Whisper Creek is one of them. I still have nightmares about it. In my dreams, I'm back at that pool, but this time I can see clearly into the depths. I see what those things really are, see where they came from, see what they're capable of. And in the dream, the milky water spreads beyond the pool, into the creek, into the river, into the entire watershed. I see it flowing downstream, reaching towns and cities, reaching Portland. I wake up sweating, my heart racing, and I check the news obsessively for reports of fish kills or water contamination in the Clackamas River system. So far, there's been nothing. Whatever's in Whisper Creek seems to be staying there, contained in that remote pool deep in the mountains. But I wonder sometimes if it's spreading slowly, moving through underground channels, finding new pools and streams to infect. I wonder if what I saw is just one colony of many, if there are other places like Whisper Creek scattered throughout these mountains, places where the water has been turned into something poisonous and alive. And I wonder what will happen if they ever connect, if these isolated pockets of corruption ever merge into something larger. What happens when the contamination reaches the major rivers, the reservoirs that supply drinking water to millions of people? I try not to think about it, but I can't help myself. I've seen what those things can do to fish, seen how quickly they can corrupt living tissue. I've seen how they can change the water itself into something that kills on contact. Sometimes I think I should report it to someone. The EPA, the Forest Service, someone with the authority and resources to investigate. But what would I tell them? That I saw something pale in a mountain pool? That the water looked milky? They'd dismiss it as algae or sediment or my imagination. And even if they did investigate, I'm not sure they'd find anything. Those things seemed intelligent enough to hide when they needed to. So I keep quiet, and I stay away from the mountains. I spend my retirement in my garden now, working with soil and plants, things I can understand and control. My fly rods sit in the garage, gathering dust. My wife is happy that I found a new hobby, something safer than wading in cold mountain streams. But I miss it. The fishing, the solitude, the connection with nature. I miss standing in clean water and casting to rising trout, I miss that feeling of peace that used to wash over me when I was out there in the wilderness. Whisper Creek took that from me. Whatever's in that pool corrupted more than just the water and the fish. It corrupted my relationship with the places I loved, tainted my memories of every stream I've ever fished. Now, when I look at moving water, I don't see beauty. I see potential danger. I see places where things that shouldn't exist might be lurking in the depths. And I wonder if I'm the only one. I wonder how many other fishermen have encountered things like this, and like me, stayed silent because they knew no one would believe them. How many other remote streams and pools harbor these corrupted things? The water in our world is connected. Streams feed into rivers, rivers feed into oceans. Everything flows together eventually. And if these things are spreading, moving through the waterways, adapting, growing stronger, I don't like to think about where that leads. I don't like to imagine a future where all water becomes dangerous, where the things in Whisper Creek become the rule rather than the exception. But late at night when I can't sleep, that's exactly what I think about. And I pray that I'm wrong, that what I saw was an isolated phenomenon, a quirk of nature that will remain contained in that one forgotten pool in the Cascade Mountains.
But deep down, I don't believe that. Deep down, I know that what I encountered in Whisper Creek is just the beginning, and that terrifies me more than anything else.
Story 7 comes from Michael Chen, a charter fishing captain from San Diego, California. My name is Michael Chen, and I've been running sport fishing charters out of San Diego for 22 years. I specialize in long-range trips, multi-day excursions down the Baja California coast, targeting tuna, dorado, and marlin. It's demanding work, but I love it. The open ocean, the challenge of finding fish in thousands of square miles of water, the satisfaction of putting clients on trophy catches. It's what I was born to do. At least, that's what I thought until last July. Now I'm not sure what I believe anymore. I had a group of 6 clients booked for a 5-day trip. They were experienced anglers, regulars who'd fished with me several times before. We planned to head down to the Finger Bank, about 150 miles south of the border, where the fishing had been exceptional according to recent reports. We left San Diego at 4 a.m. on a Tuesday, my boat fully provisioned with fuel, food, bait, and tackle. The weather forecast looked perfect. Calm seas, light winds, clear skies. My crew consisted of my first mate, Carlos, who'd been working with me for 8 years, and a deckhand named Jesse, a college kid working his summer break. The trip down was uneventful. We made good time, and by late afternoon we were approaching the Finger Bank. This is an underwater seamount that rises from the deep ocean floor to within about 200 feet of the surface. The upwelling currents around it concentrate bait fish, which in turn attracts the predators we were after. We started seeing signs of fish immediately, birds working the surface, occasional boils where tuna were feeding. The clients were excited, already rigging their rods and talking about the catches they were going to make. We spent the rest of that day fishing with excellent success. Yellowfin tuna mostly, with a few dorado mixed in. By sunset, we had a solid catch and some very happy clients. We anchored in about 300 feet of water on the lee side of the bank, had dinner, and settled in for the night. The ocean at night is a different world. The darkness is absolute. No light pollution this far from shore, just stars, and the small glow from the boat's running lights. I love it usually, that sense of being suspended between the sky and the depths. But that night felt different somehow. The air was heavy, oppressive, and there was an unusual smell, faint but noticeable, like ozone mixed with something organic. I mentioned it to Carlos during his watch around 11 p.m. He'd noticed it too, but figured it was just seaweed or maybe a dead whale somewhere nearby. These things happen at sea. We didn't think much about it. Around 2 a.m., I was in my bunk when Carlos woke me up. "Skip, you need to see this." His voice had an edge to it that got me moving fast. I pulled on my clothes and headed up to the bridge. "What's going on?" Carlos pointed over the stern. "Look at the water." I looked and felt my stomach drop. The water behind the boat was glowing. Not the blue-green bioluminescence you sometimes see from plankton. This was different. It was a deep red color, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat, and it was spreading outward from directly beneath our position. "How long has it been doing that?" I asked. He said, "I first noticed it maybe 10 minutes ago. It started as just a small patch, but it's been growing. And Skip, the fish finder is showing something weird." I checked the fish finder screen. The bottom was at 300 feet, clearly marked. But between us and the bottom, there was a massive return, something large, or maybe a dense school of something, rising up from the depths. It was about 150 feet down and still ascending. "Get the clients up," I said, "and start the engines. We're moving." Carlos nodded and went to wake everyone while I fired up the main engines. But when I engaged the props, nothing happened. The engines were running fine, but the boat wasn't moving. It was like we were stuck fast to something.
I tried reversing, then forward again. Same result. We were anchored, but this wasn't anchor drag. The boat was being held in place by something else. The red glow in the water was brighter now, illuminating the surface around us in an eerie crimson light, and I could see shapes in that light. Things moving just beneath the surface, circling the boat. The clients were emerging from their bunks, confused and worried. "What's happening?" one of them asked. Before I could answer, something hit the hull, hard. The entire boat shuddered from the impact, and I heard several people cry out in alarm. Another impact, this time on the other side. Then another. Something was ramming us, deliberately and repeatedly. The hits were coming from below, striking the hull with tremendous force. "Everyone, get your life jackets on," I ordered, trying to keep my voice calm. "Now!" Jesse was at the stern, looking down into the glowing water. "Captain, you need to see this." I joined him at the rail, and immediately wished I hadn't. In the red glow, I could see them clearly now. The things that were hitting our hull. They looked like fish, but wrong. Massive tuna, maybe 300 pounds each, but their bodies were malformed, covered in growths that pulsed with that same red light. Their eyes were oversized and bulging, and their mouths were open, revealing teeth that tuna don't have. Rows of sharp, backward-pointing teeth, like you'd see on a deep-sea predator. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all circling the boat in synchronized patterns. And they weren't just ramming us randomly. They were working together, hitting the same spots on the hull over and over, like they were trying to break through. "What the fuck are those?" Jesse whispered. I didn't have an answer. In 22 years of fishing these waters, I'd never seen anything like this. These weren't natural fish. They couldn't be. Carlos called down from the bridge, "Skip, the fish finder! You need to see this!" I climbed back up. The screen showed that whatever had been rising from the depths was now directly beneath us, maybe 50 feet down. It was massive, taking up the entire screen, so large that the fish finder couldn't determine where it ended.
and it was still rising. I said, "Cut the anchor line. Do it now." Carlos grabbed the emergency axe we kept on the bridge and started hacking at the anchor line. But before he could cut through it, the line went slack. Something had severed it from below. The boat lurched forward suddenly, the engines finally catching and driving us ahead. But we weren't free. We were being pulled, not by the anchor, by something else. The boat was moving through the water, but not in the direction I was steering. We were being dragged in a circle around the glowing patch of water. The impacts on the hull continued, those corrupted tuna still ramming us with mechanical persistence. I could hear the hull groaning under the stress, and I knew we couldn't take much more of this. One of the clients, a man named Robert, who'd been fishing with me for years, grabbed my arm. "Michael, we need to call for help. Call the Coast Guard." I tried the radio. Dead. Tried my satellite phone. Also dead. Tried the emergency beacon. Nothing. Every piece of communication equipment on the boat had failed simultaneously.
The thing beneath us was still rising. I could see it now in the red glow, a shape that defied description. It was organic, that much was clear, but its structure made no sense. It seemed to be all tentacles or appendages, hundreds of them, writhing and intertwining in patterns that hurt to look at. And embedded throughout this mass were what looked like eyes. Not fish eyes or squid eyes, but something else entirely. They were too large, too aware, and they were all looking up at us. The corrupted tuna were becoming more frenzied, their attacks on the hull intensifying. I could see cracks forming in the fiberglass near the waterline. We were taking on water. "Everyone to the life raft," I shouted. "Prepare to abandon ship." Carlos and Jesse started breaking out the life raft, while I tried desperately to get the engines to respond to steering. We were still being pulled in that circular pattern, and the red glow was spreading, covering more and more of the ocean's surface. That's when I noticed something else. The water itself was changing. Where the red glow was strongest, the water looked thicker, almost gelatinous, and things were floating in it. Not fish, but pieces of fish, partially dissolved, mixed with what might have been seaweed or might have been parts of that thing beneath us. The smell was overwhelming now, that mix of ozone and decay, so strong that several people were gagging. One of the clients, a woman named Sarah, pointed toward the horizon. "Look, another boat!" I turned and saw running lights in the distance, maybe 2 miles away. Another fishing boat, probably heading for the same grounds we'd been targeting. I grabbed the spotlight and started flashing SOS, hoping they'd see it and stay away. But even as I did, I saw their lights change course. They were turning toward us. "No," I muttered, "no, stay away." But they kept coming, drawn perhaps by our lights or by the strange red glow that now covered at least 100 yards of ocean surface. The radio crackled suddenly. Just static, but it was the first sign of life from our communications equipment since this started. I grabbed the mic. "Any vessel approaching the finger bank, this is the Sea Chaser. Do not approach. Repeat, do not approach. Dangerous conditions. Steer clear of the red glow in the water." Just static in response. I tried again, same message. The other boat kept coming. Our hull finally gave way. I heard the crack, felt the boat lurch, and suddenly water was pouring into the cabin. The corrupted tuna had succeeded in breaching the hull. "Life raft, now!" I screamed. Carlos and Jesse had it inflated and over the side. The client scrambled to get in, while Carlos and I grabbed emergency supplies. Water, flares, the emergency kit. The boat was sinking fast, listing heavily to starboard. I took one last look at the fish finder before the water reached it. The thing beneath us was massive. The screen showed it extending down at least 500 feet, maybe more. And it wasn't a solid mass. It was more like a network, a web of organic material that stretched across the entire seamount. We got everyone into the life raft and pushed away from the sinking boat. The corrupted tuna didn't follow us. They stayed with the sea chaser as it went down, ramming it until the last piece disappeared beneath the red water. We drifted in the life raft, watching that red glow, watching the approach of the other boat. I kept trying to signal them with the flashlight, kept trying to warn them away, but they didn't respond. When they reached the edge of the red water, their engines died. I could hear the crew shouting, see them rushing around on deck. Then the red glow spread beneath their boat, and the attacks began. It took less than an hour for their boat to sink. They got their life raft deployed, and they drifted toward us. When they were close enough, we pulled them aboard our raft. There were 4 of them, all in shock, none of them able to articulate what had just happened. We sat there in the life raft through the rest of the night, watching the red glow pulse and spread. The thing beneath us, whatever it was, stayed down after the second boat sank. The corrupted tuna disappeared. By dawn, even the red glow had faded, leaving nothing but normal ocean water. A Coast Guard helicopter found us around 9 a.m. They'd picked up our emergency beacon signal once it started working again around sunrise. They airlifted all 10 of us to safety and sent a cutter to investigate the site. They found nothing. No wreckage, no red water, no sign that anything unusual had occurred. Just normal ocean, normal fish, normal conditions. We were debriefed separately, and I could tell they didn't believe us. 2 boats sinking in the same location, both with the same story about glowing water and corrupted fish. They thought we hit the same underwater obstacle, that shock and darkness had made us see things that weren't there. But I know what I saw. We all know what we saw, and the proof is in the insurance photos. When they examined the life rafts and the limited debris that eventually washed up, they found marks on the rubber, bite marks with teeth patterns that don't match any known species of fish. The area around the finger bank was closed for 3 weeks while NOAA investigated. When they reopened it, their official statement said they'd found nothing unusual, that the area was safe for fishing. But I've talked to other captains who fish those waters. Quietly, in bars, or at the fuel dock, they tell stories about red glows in the water, about equipment failures, about fish that look wrong, about massive returns on their fish finders that don't match any known marine life. Most of them still fish the finger bank. They need the income, and the fishing is too good to pass up, but they're careful now. They don't anchor at night, they stay in groups, and at the first sign of anything unusual, they run. I don't fish there anymore. I don't fish anywhere in that general area. I've moved my operation north, focusing on waters closer to San Diego. My clients complain that we don't catch as many big fish, but I don't care. I know what's out there, what's down in those deep waters where the seamounts rise up from the abyss. Carlos quit after that trip. He sold his house in San Diego and moved to Colorado, as far from the ocean as he could get. He calls me sometimes, and we don't talk about that night directly, but I can hear it in his voice. The same fear I feel, the same knowledge that we encountered something that shouldn't exist. Jesse went back to college and changed his major from marine biology to accounting. He told me he never wants to see the ocean again. The clients don't fish anymore either. Robert sold all his tackle and bought a cabin in the mountains. Sarah moved to Arizona. The others scattered across the country,
all of them putting as much distance between themselves and the sea as possible.
I still captain my boat, still take clients fishing, but something changed in me that night. When I look out at the ocean now, I don't see just water. I see a vast unknown, a place where things we can't comprehend live and hunt and grow. I see danger lurking in every shadow beneath the surface. And I wonder how many of those seamounts harbor things like what we encountered. How many places in the deep ocean host these corrupted ecosystems? How many fishing boats have disappeared over the years, their crews encountering things they couldn't escape, things that left no evidence behind? The ocean covers 70% of our planet, and we've explored less than 5% of it. We tell ourselves we know what's down there, but we don't. We have no idea what lives in the deep trenches, what grows on the isolated seamounts, what waits in the darkness where sunlight never penetrates. I dream about it sometimes. I'm back on the Sea Chaser, watching that red glow spread across the water, feeling the impacts as those corrupted tuna ram the hull. But in the dream, I look down and see that thing clearly, see its true form, see how vast it really is. And I realize that what we encountered that night wasn't a creature. It was a part of something much larger, a node in a network that stretches across the ocean floor, connecting seamount to seamount, trench to trench. In the dream, I see how it spreads, how it corrupts and converts everything it touches, turning normal marine life into extensions of itself. I see it growing, expanding, consuming more and more of the ocean's biomass. And I see that we're running out of time, that eventually the corrupted zones will connect, will spread beyond the deep seamounts, will reach the coastal waters where millions of people depend on the ocean for food and livelihood. I wake up from these dreams in a cold sweat, and I check the news obsessively for reports of strange catches or unexplained phenomena at sea. There are more reports than you'd think if you know what to look for. Fish with unusual deformities, areas where nothing bites, mysterious red tides that don't match known algae blooms, equipment failures in specific locations. Each report is explained away individually: pollution, disease, equipment malfunction. But when you look at them all together, when you see the pattern, it's clear that something is happening in our oceans. Something is changing down there in the depths, and we're not ready for it. We're not equipped to deal with something that can corrupt entire ecosystems, that can turn the ocean itself into something hostile and alive. We're not prepared for a threat that comes from the 95% of the ocean we haven't even explored. I think about the clients on my boat that night, how easily we could have all died. How, if that thing beneath us had wanted to, it could have killed us in seconds. But it didn't. It just damaged our boats and let us escape. Why? Was it not interested in us? Were we too small, too insignificant? Or was it studying us, learning about us, preparing for something? I don't have answers to these questions. I'm just a fishing captain who saw something he wasn't supposed to see, who glimpsed something that exists in the spaces between what we know and what we refuse to believe. But I know this: the ocean is not what we think it is. It's not a resource to be exploited or a playground for recreation. It's a frontier, a vast, unknown territory where things older and stranger than we can imagine still thrive in the darkness. And those things are waking up. They're spreading. They're coming closer to the surface, closer to shore, closer to us. God help us when they finally arrive in force. God help us all.
Story 8 comes from Walter Morrison, a retired fisherman from the coast of Maine. My name is Walter Morrison, and I'm 74 years old. I've been fishing the waters off the coast of Maine since I was 8 years old, when my father first took me out in his lobster boat. I spent 56 years making my living from the sea, lobstering mostly, but also some commercial fishing for cod and haddock when the seasons allowed. The ocean was my life, my livelihood, and my heritage. 3 generations of Morrisons made their living from these cold Atlantic waters. I retired 5 years ago, sold my boat and my traps, and settled into what I thought would be a peaceful old age in my house overlooking Penobscot Bay. My wife Margaret and I had plans: travel, spend time with our grandchildren, enjoy the years we had left without the back-breaking work of hauling traps. But I couldn't stay away from the water completely. Old habits die hard. So 2 years ago, I bought a small skiff, nothing fancy, just a 16-footer with a small outboard motor. I'd take it out on calm days, maybe catch a few mackerel or striped bass, nothing serious, just enough to keep me connected to the sea that had defined my entire life. Last October, on an unusually warm afternoon, I decided to head out to a spot I'd fished as a boy. It's a small cove on an uninhabited island about 3 miles from the mainland, sheltered and deep, the kind of place where fish like to hold. I hadn't been there in probably 40 years, had no reason to go there during my working years since there were better lobstering grounds elsewhere. The trip out was pleasant. The bay was calm, the sun was warm, and I had my thermos of coffee and a couple of sandwiches Margaret had made. I was looking forward to a peaceful afternoon, maybe catching dinner, definitely enjoying the solitude. When I reached the cove, I cut the motor and let the skiff drift while I got my rod ready. The water was clear, unusually clear for Maine, where the water tends to be murky with sediment and plankton. I could see down maybe 20 feet, see the rocky bottom and the kelp bed swaying in the gentle current. I cast out with a silver spoon, a lure that usually works well for mackerel, and started retrieving it slowly. Nothing on the first few casts, which wasn't unusual. Sometimes you need to work an area for a while before the fish start biting. On my 5th or 6th cast, I snagged something. The line went tight, but it wasn't fighting like a fish, just dead weight, stuck on the bottom. I tried to work it free, but it wouldn't budge. Finally, I started pulling harder, figuring I'd either free it or break the line. The line came free suddenly, and as I reeled in, I realized I'd brought something up with it. Not a fish, something else. It was wrapped around my lure and line, a thick, ropey strand of what looked like seaweed. But as I pulled it into the boat, I realized it wasn't seaweed. The texture was wrong, too smooth, too uniform. And the color was off, a pale greenish gray that didn't match any marine plant I knew. I examined it more closely. It was about 3 feet long and maybe an inch thick, with a consistency like rubber or cartilage. There were no leaves or fronds like you'd expect from seaweed. Instead, it had small nodules or bumps running along its length, and those nodules were moving, pulsing rhythmically like tiny hearts beating. I should have thrown it back immediately, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know what this thing was. So I laid it in the bottom of the boat and took out my phone to photograph it, thinking maybe I could identify it later online or show it to someone at the marine biology lab at the university. As I was photographing it, the strands started to move. Not just the pulsing nodules, but the entire thing. It writhed like a snake, coiling and uncoiling, and I realized with horror that it was reaching toward the water at the bottom of the boat,
bilge water that had accumulated from spray and a small leak I'd been meaning to fix. The moment the strand touched the water, it seemed to come alive. It spread out rapidly, dissolving into the water like ink, turning the small puddle of bilge water that same pale greenish-gray color, and the water itself changed consistency, becoming thicker, more viscous. I grabbed a rag and tried to soak up the contaminated water, but it wouldn't absorb into the cloth. Instead, it seemed to repel the fabric, sliding away from it. And where the gray water touched the plastic bottom of my skiff, the plastic started to change color, darkening and becoming pitted.
I looked over the side of the boat into the clear water of the cove and felt my blood run cold. The same gray discoloration was spreading beneath my boat, not on the surface, but about 10 feet down, spreading out in a circle that was growing rapidly. And in that gray water, I could see things moving, long, ropey strands like the one I'd pulled up, but there were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all tangled together in a massive mat that seemed to cover the entire bottom of the cove. The mat was rising toward the surface, rising toward my boat. As it came closer, I could see more detail. The strands weren't uniform. Some were thick as my arm, others thin as string. They were all connected, forming a network that looked almost like a nervous system or a web. And those pulsing nodules were everywhere, all beating in sync, all glowing faintly with that same sickly light I'd seen in other stories, though I didn't know that then. Where the mat touched the kelp beds on the bottom, the kelp died instantly. The brown fronds turned black and dissolved, becoming part of the gray water. Fish that had been sheltering in the kelp tried to swim away, but most of them didn't make it. The gray water was spreading too fast. I watched in horror as a school of small fish, herring or menhaden, I couldn't tell which, got caught in the expanding contamination. They convulsed briefly, then went still and began to dissolve, their bodies breaking down and adding to the gray mass. One fish made it to clear water, swimming frantically toward the surface. It broke through right next to my boat, and I got a good look at it. It was a mackerel, maybe a foot long, but it was already changing. Its scales were falling off, its eyes were clouding over, and there was something growing on its skin. Thin strands of that same gray material spreading across its body like a fungus. The fish floated at the surface for a moment, still twitching, and then those strands seemed to take control. The fish dove back down, swimming jerkily, but with purpose, heading back toward the gray mat at the bottom. It was being called back, pulled back to become part of that terrible network. I started my motor, but before I could engage it, I felt something wrap around the propeller. One of those strands had reached my boat. I threw the motor into neutral and looked over the stern. Several strands had indeed attached themselves to the motor, wrapping around the propeller shaft and the lower unit, and they were climbing. As I watched, more strands emerged from the water, reaching up the sides of my skiff like tentacles. Where they touched the fiberglass hull, they left marks, darkened patches where the material was being degraded. I grabbed my tackle knife and started cutting. The strands were tough, like cutting through rope, but the knife was sharp, and I was motivated by pure terror. I cut through one, then another, then another. They kept coming, more and more of them reaching up from the gray water that now surrounded my boat completely. I got the motor free and jammed it into forward, opening the throttle as far as it would go. The little outboard screamed, and the skiff lurched forward, tearing free from the remaining strands. Some of them came with us, still attached to the hull, whipping in the wind as we moved. I didn't slow down until I was out of the cove and into clean water. Even then, I kept the throttle wide open, wanting as much distance as possible between me and whatever that thing was. When I finally felt safe enough to stop and check the boat, I found 3 of those strands still attached to the hull. They'd gone dormant or died, I couldn't tell which, when they left the water. They hung there limply, no longer pulsing, no longer trying to spread. I used my knife to cut them free and kicked them overboard, watching to make sure they sank and didn't start moving again. The hull where they had attached was damaged. The fiberglass was pitted and discolored, the gel coat completely eaten away in spots. I'd need to have it repaired, though I wasn't sure how I'd explain the damage. I motored back to the marina slowly, my hands shaking on the tiller. When I got there, I pulled the skiff out of the water immediately and hosed it down thoroughly with fresh water, wanting to make sure no trace of that gray material remained. That night I couldn't eat dinner. I sat on my porch overlooking the bay, drinking whiskey and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Margaret knew something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out how to tell her. How do you explain something like that to someone who hasn't seen it?
The next day, I drove back out to a point where I could see the cove through binoculars. From a distance, it looked normal. The water was blue, not gray. There was no visible sign of contamination, but I knew what was down there, lurking at the bottom, waiting. I called the Coast Guard and reported it as a possible pollution incident. They said they'd send someone to investigate. 3 days later, they called me back and said they'd checked the cove and found nothing unusual. Water samples were normal, no signs of contamination. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew it was real. So I started doing research, spending hours online looking for any information about similar phenomena. That's when I started finding the stories. Other fishermen, other encounters with things that shouldn't exist in our oceans. I found reports from Maine going back over 100 years. Fishermen reporting areas of discolored water where their nets rotted and their catches died. Lobstermen finding their traps destroyed, the wood and rope degraded as if by acid. Rumors of places in the Gulf of Maine where boats avoided going, where the water was bad, though no one could quite say why. I also found something in the town library, in old newspapers from the 1920s. There was a small article about an island, the same island where I'd encountered that gray mat, that had been inhabited until 1923. The dozen or so families who lived there had abandoned it suddenly, leaving everything behind. The official explanation was that lobstering had declined, and it wasn't economically viable to stay. But I found a letter in the Historical Society archives, written by one of the last residents to a relative on the mainland. She described the water around the island turning wrong, fish dying, their boats being damaged by something in the water. She wrote that they could hear sounds at night coming from the cove, wet, slithering sounds, like something huge moving through the shallows. They'd left because they were afraid, and the cove had been left alone for 100 years until I came along and disturbed it. I went back to that point overlooking the cove a week later. This time I brought a spotting scope, a powerful optical device that would let me see more detail. I spent 2 hours scanning the water, looking for any sign of the gray contamination. I didn't see the gray water, but I did see something else. The cove was empty, completely empty. No birds diving for fish, no seals that usually hauled out on the rocks, no signs of any marine life at all. The water was dead. And at the mouth of the cove, where it opened into the larger bay, I saw a sheen on the water,
Just a thin film, barely visible, but it was there. And it was spreading, slowly but steadily, moving out into the bay with the tide. I called the Coast Guard again, more insistent this time. I told them I didn't care what their tests showed. Something was wrong in that cove, and it was spreading. They were polite, but dismissive. They'd investigated, they'd found nothing, and they had more pressing concerns than one old fisherman's worries about discolored water. So I started calling other people, the Department of Environmental Protection, the Maine Marine Patrol, the University Marine Biology Department, anyone who might listen, who might investigate. Most of them had the same response as the Coast Guard, sympathetic, but ultimately dismissive. But one person took me seriously, a young graduate student named Emily Chen, who was studying ocean acidification. She said she'd heard rumors of unusual phenomena in the Gulf of Maine, things that didn't fit into normal marine biology. She agreed to meet with me. I showed her the photographs I'd taken of the strand before it dissolved. I showed her the damage to my boat hull. I told her everything I'd seen in that cove. Emily listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions. When she finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Morrison," she finally said, "I think you might have encountered something that a few of us in the marine biology community have been tracking. We don't talk about it publicly because we don't have enough data, and frankly, because we're afraid we won't be taken seriously."
"What is it?" I asked. "We don't know exactly, but we're seeing signs of it in various locations throughout the North Atlantic, areas where the normal marine ecosystem has been disrupted, where the water chemistry changes in ways we can't explain. We've collected samples of biological material that doesn't match any known species. It seems to be some kind of organism, or possibly a colony organism, something that can spread and transform normal marine environments. Where is it coming from?" Emily shook her head. "That's the big question. Some of my colleagues think it's something that's always been here, deep in the ocean, and climate change or other environmental factors are allowing it to spread to new areas. Others think it might be something newer, maybe the result of some kind of mutation or evolution. A few even speculate it could be a non-terrestrial organism, though that's considered pretty fringe. What can we do about it? That's the other big question. We don't know how to kill it or contain it. Every attempt we've made to neutralize samples in the lab has failed. It seems to be highly resistant to heat, cold, chemicals, everything we've tried. And it spreads so quickly that by the time we identify a new outbreak, it's already established. So we're helpless?" Emily didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quiet. "I don't know. We're working on it, trying to understand it better. But yes, right now, we don't have effective countermeasures. The best we can do is monitor it, try to track its spread, and hope we can develop some way to combat it before it becomes a larger problem." That conversation was 6 months ago. Since then, I've been watching the bay obsessively. I've purchased better binoculars, a spotting scope, even a small drone with a camera that I can fly out over the water to get a better view. The contamination from the cove has spread. It's slow, maybe 100 yards in 6 months, but it's spreading. The area around the cove is now completely dead. No fish, no lobsters, no sea life of any kind. The water looks normal to a casual observer, but if you know what to look for, you can see the signs. The water has a slightly different texture, reflects light differently, and occasionally, on very calm days, you can see that faint gray tint just below the surface. Emily and her colleagues have been out several times to take samples and measurements. They've confirmed what I told them. There's something in that water, something that's killing the normal marine ecosystem and replacing it with something else. They've applied for grants to do more extensive research, but funding is slow in coming. Environmental research isn't a priority, apparently, even when we're facing something that could potentially devastate our oceans. I've tried to warn other fishermen, but most of them don't want to hear it. They have livelihoods to maintain, families to feed. They can't afford to believe that something might be making the waters unsafe. The few who do listen avoid that area, but they don't spread the word. There's an unspoken agreement to keep quiet about it, as if not talking about it will make it go away. But it's not going away. If anything, it's accelerating. Emily told me last week that they've found 2 new sites in the Gulf of Maine showing similar contamination, one near Mount Desert Island, another near Matinicus Rock. The sites are separated by miles of open ocean, which suggests either multiple origins or the ability to spread through the water column in ways they don't understand. I'm 74 years old. I've lived a good life, worked hard, raised a family, contributed to my community. I thought I'd earned a peaceful retirement. But instead, I'm watching something I don't understand destroy the ocean that sustained my family for generations. Margaret asks me why I spend so much time on the porch with my binoculars staring at the bay. I tell her I'm birdwatching, that I've developed an interest in seabirds in my old age. She doesn't believe me, but she doesn't push. She knows something's bothering me, but she also knows that sometimes it's better not to ask.
Our grandchildren want to go lobstering with me next summer, like I used to take their father when he was a boy. I don't know what to tell them. How do I explain that the ocean isn't safe anymore? How do I take them out on water that might harbor something that could kill them? I have nightmares now. I'm back in that cove, but in the dream the gray water covers everything. It's not just the cove, it's the entire bay, the entire coast. I'm in my skiff, trying to escape, but there's nowhere to go. The gray water is everywhere, and those strands are reaching up, pulling me down, pulling me into that terrible network where everything dissolves and becomes part of the mass. I wake up gasping, my heart pounding, and Margaret holds me until the fear subsides. She doesn't ask what I'm dreaming about. Maybe she doesn't want to know. Yesterday, I saw something that scared me more than anything else so far. I was watching the cove with my spotting scope when I saw a boat approaching it. A small recreational boat, probably tourists who'd rented it for the day. They were heading straight for the cove, probably thinking it looked like a nice sheltered spot for a picnic or some fishing. I tried to signal them, waving my arms, but they were too far away to see me. I called the Coast Guard, but by the time I explained the situation and they understood which boat I was talking about, it would be too late. So I just watched through my scope as they entered the cove. They anchored in the middle of it, right over where I knew that gray mat was lurking. I saw them fishing, saw them laughing and enjoying their day. They stayed for maybe an hour, catching a few fish, eating their lunch. When they left, they seemed fine. But I wonder what was attached to their hull, what they might have carried with them to wherever they went next. I wonder if they'll have any idea what they've done when their boat starts to deteriorate, when the water, wherever they moor it, starts to turn gray. Emily says the contamination seems to spread both through direct contact and through some kind of waterborne dispersal. Every boat that enters a contaminated area becomes a potential vector, carrying the organism to new locations. And we have no way to track it. No way to quarantine it, no way to stop it. The ocean is vast, And this thing, whatever it is patient. It's been growing in that cove for who knows how long, maybe decades, maybe centuries. Now it's spreading, slowly but inexorably, moving through the Gulf of Maine, potentially into the larger Atlantic. And we're helpless to stop it. We don't even really understand what it is, let alone how to fight it. We're just watching it spread, documenting its progress, writing papers that few people will read and fewer will believe. I think about my grandfather who fished these waters before me. I think about my father who taught me everything he knew about the sea. I think about the generations of Morrisons who made their living from this bay, who respected the ocean but never feared it. They never knew how lucky they were. They never had to watch their beloved ocean turn into something alien and hostile. They never had to face the possibility that the sea that gave them everything might become something that takes everything. I'm 74 years old, and I'll probably be dead before this thing spreads enough to cause the catastrophe I fear is coming. But my children are still young, my grandchildren younger still. They'll inherit this world, this ocean that's changing in ways we can't control or even understand. And I don't know what to tell them. I don't know how to prepare them for a future where the ocean might no longer be a source of life and livelihood, but a source of danger and death. So I sit on my porch, watching the bay, tracking the slow spread of the gray water, documenting everything I see. Maybe someday someone will read my notes and understand what happened here, how it started. Maybe it will help them find a way to stop it. Or maybe it's already too late. Maybe we passed the point of no return years ago, decades ago, and we just didn't know it. Maybe the ocean has already been lost, and we're just too stubborn or too scared to admit it. I don't know. I'm just an old fisherman who saw something he shouldn't have seen, who knows something he wishes he didn't know. And I'm watching my world die, one gray patch at a time, with no power to stop it. God help us all. God help the ocean. And God help anyone who depends on the sea for their survival, because I don't think we have much time left.
Story 9 comes from James Hartford, a fishing tournament professional from Louisiana. My name is James Hartford, and up until 8 months ago, I made a very comfortable living as a professional bass fisherman. I competed in tournaments across the South, had several sponsorship deals with tackle companies, and even hosted a small fishing show on a regional sports network. Bass fishing was my passion, my career, and my identity. I grew up in southern Louisiana, learned to fish in the bayous and swamps before I could ride a bike. My daddy was a fishing guide, and he taught me everything: how to read water, how to understand what bass were thinking, how to put clients on fish even on the toughest days. By the time I was 16, I was winning local tournaments. By 25, I'd turned pro. I fished some of the best bass waters in the country: Lake Fork in Texas, Lake Okeechobee in Florida, Gunnersville in Alabama. But my favorite has always been Toledo Bend Reservoir, a massive lake straddling the Louisiana-Texas border. It's over 185,000 acres of prime bass habitat, full of structure and cover, and it produces some of the biggest largemouth bass in the South. Last November, I was preparing for a major tournament on Toledo Bend with a $100,000 first-place prize. I'd been pre-fishing for a week, trying to locate where the bass were holding and what patterns were working.
The water temperature had dropped into the mid-60s, which meant the bass were transitioning to their fall feeding patterns, staging on points and humps before moving shallow. I was fishing alone. I always pre-fish alone to keep my spots secret in a section of the lake I'd fished dozens of times before. It's an area on the Louisiana side with lots of submerged timber and brush piles, the kind of structure that bass love. The water depth ranges from about 15 to 30 feet, perfect for this time of year. I'd been fishing for about 3 hours and had caught maybe a dozen bass, a couple of them in the 5-pound range that would definitely help in the tournament. I was feeling good about my chances, thinking I'd found a winning pattern. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was working a deep-diving crankbait along a submerged creek channel when my electronics started acting strange. My graph, the fish finder that shows what's below the boat, began flickering, showing returns that didn't make sense. It looked like a massive school of bait fish, maybe gizzard shad, directly beneath me. But the school was too dense, too solid. It looked more like the bottom than fish. I idled forward slowly, watching the graph. The mass beneath me, whatever it was, began to rise. It came up from about 25 feet to 15 feet, then 10 feet. My depth finder showed it as a solid return, completely obscuring the actual bottom. I looked over the side of the boat. The water in Toledo Bend is typically stained, a tea color from the tannins leaching out of the cypress trees and vegetation. You usually can't see more than a couple feet down. But as I looked, I could see a shape in the water below me. A dark shape, massive, that seemed to fill the entire area beneath my boat. And it was moving. Not swimming like a school of fish, but undulating, pulsing, like something breathing or maybe digesting. I started my big motor, planning to move to a different area. But when I shifted into gear, the motor strained like I was pulling something heavy. The boat barely moved, the motor revving high but not generating any forward motion. I shifted to neutral and looked over the stern. There was something wrapped around my lower unit, something thick and dark that disappeared down into the murky water. It looked organic like a vine or root, but it was moving, tightening around the motor housing.
I grabbed my push-pole. Bass boats carry them for shallow water navigation, and tried to poke at whatever had attached itself to my motor. The moment the pole touched it, the thing grabbed the pole. That's the only way I can describe it. The pole was yanked out of my hands so hard it bruised my palms, and it disappeared into the water in an instant. More of those vine-like appendages were emerging from the water now, reaching up the sides of my boat. Where they touched the fiberglass hull, they stuck fast, and I could hear a sound like sizzling. The gel coat was blistering and bubbling where the things made contact. I grabbed my fillet knife, the sharpest blade I had, and started cutting. The vines were tough, fibrous, but the knife was sharp, and I was motivated by pure terror. I cut through one, then another, but more kept coming. It was like trying to hold back a flood. One of them wrapped around my ankle. I felt it tighten immediately, felt something warm and wet soaking through my jeans. I slashed at it with the knife, and it released, leaving behind a burn mark on my ankle that went through my jeans and into my skin. The mass beneath the boat was rising faster now. I could see it clearly despite the stained water. A roiling, seething bulk of organic material that didn't look like any living thing I'd ever seen. It was dark brown to black in color, covered with those vine appendages, and the surface of it was constantly moving, constantly shifting like it was made of thousands of smaller organisms all working together. My boat was being pulled down. The stern was settling lower in the water, the base boat sitting low anyway, and water was starting to come over the back deck. I had maybe minutes before I swamped completely. I made a decision. I grabbed my emergency kit,
waterproof bag with flares, satellite beacon, first aid supplies, and my cell phone. Then I kicked off my shoes and dove over the side, away from the mass, swimming hard for the nearest timber. The water was cold, probably 65 degrees, and the shock of it took my breath away. But adrenaline drove me forward. I swam maybe 30 yards before I reached a large cypress tree that still had branches above the waterline. I grabbed onto it and pulled myself up, getting my head and shoulders above water. I looked back at my boat. The entire stern was underwater now, and those vine appendages had completely covered it, wrapping around every surface. The mass beneath it had fully surfaced, and I could see now that what I'd thought was one creature was actually countless smaller organisms, all connected by those vine-like structures into one massive colony. And the colony was consuming my boat. I watched in horror as the fiberglass hull began to dissolve where those things touched it. Not slowly. This was happening in real time. The boat literally melting before my eyes. Within 5 minutes, there was nothing left but some floating debris and an oil slick on the water. The colony submerged again, the entire mass sinking back into the depths, taking the remains of my boat with it. Within minutes, the water looked normal again. Just the usual stained brown water of Toledo Bend. If I hadn't witnessed it myself, I never would have believed it had happened. I clung to that cypress tree, shaking from cold and fear, trying to figure out what to do. I was about 2 miles from the nearest boat ramp, in an area where other anglers didn't fish much because the timber was so thick. I couldn't swim that far, especially not in water that might contain more of those things. I managed to get my cell phone out of the waterproof bag. No signal. I was in a dead zone, but the phone itself was dry and working. I activated the GPS and started looking at my options. The nearest land was a small island maybe 400 yards away. It was just a hump of dirt with a few trees, probably underwater during spring floods, but it was solid ground. I thought I could make that swim if I had to.
I waited in that tree for about an hour, scanning the water around me, looking for any sign of the colony. The water remained still, showing no sign of what lurked beneath. Finally, I decided I had to risk it. The sun would be setting in a few hours, and I didn't want to be out here in the dark. I lowered myself back into the water as quietly as I could and started swimming toward the island. I've never swum so fast in my life, every second expecting to feel those vines wrapping around my legs, pulling me down. But I made it to the island without incident, pulled myself onto the muddy bank, and collapsed. From the island, I could see other boats in the distance, anglers fishing the main lake. I tried waving and shouting, but I was too far away. They couldn't see or hear me. As the sun started to set, I activated the emergency beacon in my kit. It would send a distress signal to the Coast Guard with my GPS coordinates. Help would come, but it might take hours. I spent the night on that island, cold and wet, watching the water around me for any sign of movement. Every sound made me jump. A fish jumping, a bird calling, the wind in the trees. I barely slept, just dozed in short bursts before jolting awake. A bass boat found me around 9 the next morning. 2 tournament anglers who'd heard about the emergency beacon and had come to help. They were surprised to find me alive and relatively unhurt, but concerned about my story. "What happened to your boat?" one of them asked. I didn't know what to tell them. How do you explain what I'd seen without sounding crazy? So I lied. I told them I'd hit a submerged stump, the boat had taken on water fast, and I'd barely made it to the island before it sank. They accepted this explanation. Sunken boats aren't uncommon on Toledo Bend with all the timber. They took me back to the ramp, and from there, I went straight to the hospital to get checked out. The burn on my ankle was puzzling to the doctors. It looked like a chemical burn, but I'd been in water, which doesn't make sense. They treated it with burn cream and antibiotics, but it took 3 weeks to fully heal and left a permanent scar, a ring around my ankle exactly where that vine had wrapped around me. I filed an insurance claim for my boat, sticking with the story about hitting a stump. The insurance company sent the diver down to survey the wreckage and recover what they could. The diver spent 2 days searching the area where my GPS showed I'd been fishing. He found nothing. No wreckage, no debris, nothing. It was like the boat had never existed. The insurance company accused me of fraud, claimed I'd sold the boat and was trying to collect insurance money. It took 6 months and a lawyer to finally get them to pay out, and even then, they didn't believe my story. They just couldn't prove fraud, so they had to pay. But the worst part wasn't the insurance hassle, or even losing my boat. The worst part was what came after. 2 weeks after my incident, another angler went missing on Toledo Bend. He was fishing alone, and when he didn't come back, his wife reported him missing. They found his boat 3 days later, drifting in the main lake, but he was gone. No signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of what had happened. His tackle was still in the boat. His wallet and phone were there. He just vanished. The authorities ruled it an accidental drowning, figured he'd fallen overboard somehow and couldn't get back in the boat. But I knew better. I knew what probably took him.
Over the next few months, there were more incidents, boats damaged by unknown causes, anglers reporting strange readings on their electronics, a few more disappearances, all written off as accidents or drownings. I tried to warn people. I went to the Lake Management Authority, to the Sheriff's Department, to anyone who would listen. I told them there was something in the lake, something dangerous. They humored me, but didn't take it seriously. After all, I was the guy who'd claimed his boat sank but left no wreckage. My credibility was shot. I hired a friend of mine who's a videographer to come out on the lake with me. I'd bought a cheap used boat by then, to try to document what I'd seen. We went back to the same area, used the same techniques, tried to locate that colony or whatever it was. We found nothing. The water was normal. The electronics showed normal fish activity. There was no sign of anything unusual. But 2 days after our unsuccessful expedition, my friend called me. He was sick, fever, nausea, strange skin lesions on his hands and arms. The lesions looked like burns, but appeared spontaneously, not from any external cause. He went to the doctor, who couldn't identify what was causing them. They tested for everything: bacterial infection, viral infection, fungal infection, parasites. All the tests came back negative. My friend got worse over the next week. The lesions spread across his body. He developed respiratory problems. Eventually, he had to be hospitalized. I visited him in the hospital. He looked terrible. Pale, sweating, covered in those angry red lesions. "What did we touch out there?" he asked me. "What was in that water?" I didn't have an answer. We hadn't touched anything unusual. We had just been on the lake, had gotten some water on us from spray. Normal fishing stuff.
but something had affected him. My friend died 3 weeks later. The doctors listed the cause of death as systemic organ failure of unknown etiology. His wife blamed me, said I'd taken him somewhere dangerous, exposed him to something toxic. She might be right. I stopped fishing after that, sold my boat, canceled my tournament registrations, told my sponsors I was retiring. Most of them were relieved. I'd become a liability, associated with accidents and strange stories. But I couldn't stop thinking about Toledo Bend, about what was in that lake. I started researching the reservoir's history. It was created in 1969 when they dammed the Sabine River. Before that, the area was just river and bottomland forest. Thousands of acres of trees were left standing when they flooded the valley, and those dead trees still stand today, creating the timber habitat that bass love. But I found something else in my research. Before the dam was built, there were complaints from people who lived in the area. They talked about sections of the river that smelled bad, where fish died for no reason, where the water looked wrong. There were even a few reports of people getting sick after swimming in certain areas. These complaints were dismissed as concerns about natural swamp gas or tannins from decaying vegetation. The dam project went ahead as planned. What if whatever was in the river got trapped when they created the reservoir? What if 40 years of containment allowed it to grow, to spread, to become something much larger and more dangerous? I found historical records from before European settlement, journals from early explorers and traders who traveled the Sabine River. Several of them mentioned areas they avoided, places where the Native Americans warned them not to go, places where the water was sick, where people disappeared.
This thing, whatever it is, has been here for a long time. Maybe centuries, maybe longer. We just gave it a bigger pool to grow in when we created Toledo Bend. I tried to contact environmental agencies, scientific organizations, anyone who might investigate. I sent emails, made phone calls, even tried to contact some university biology departments. Most didn't respond. Those that did were polite but dismissive. Without physical evidence, without samples or documentation, there was nothing they could do. One researcher did take me seriously, Dr. Sarah Mitchell from LSU, who studies aquatic ecosystems. I sent her everything I had, my story, my photographs of the burn on my ankle, the medical records from my friend's illness, the historical research I'd compiled. She called me a few weeks later. "Mr. Hartford, I believe you saw something unusual, and I think you might be right that there's something in Toledo Bend that doesn't belong there. But I need to be honest with you. Without funding for a proper investigation, without clear evidence, I can't do anything official. The university won't support research based on anecdotal reports. So you believe me, but you can't help? I believe something happened to you, and I'm seeing patterns in the data from Toledo Bend that concern me. Declining fish populations in certain areas, water quality issues that don't match any known pollution sources, unusual reports from anglers and locals. Something is affecting the lake's ecosystem, but proving it's related to your experience, that's difficult." She paused, then added, "I can tell you this unofficially. You're not the only one who's contacted me with stories about Toledo Bend.
I've received 3 other reports in the past year from people who've encountered something strange in that lake. Different locations, similar descriptions. Something in the water that shouldn't be there. Something that's aggressive toward boats and people. What do you think it is? I don't know. It could be some kind of invasive species that's found an ecological niche in the reservoir. It could be a mutation of native organisms, possibly triggered by chemical contamination we haven't identified. Or it could be something we've never seen before, something unique to this environment. How do we stop it? Dr. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Hartford, I'm not sure we can. If this organism or colony or whatever it is has been in the Sabine River system for centuries, it's well established. And if it's adapted to survive in a reservoir environment, it might be spreading throughout the entire lake. Trying to eradicate it could be impossible without destroying the lake itself. That conversation was 3 months ago. Since then, I've been monitoring news from Toledo Bend obsessively. The incidents continue. Boats damaged, anglers disappearing, strange reports that get explained away as accidents or equipment failure. But people are starting to notice. Fishing forums online have threads about weird stuff on Toledo Bend. Participation in tournaments is down. Some of the fishing lodges and guides are reporting fewer bookings. People are nervous, even if they don't know exactly why. I've been contacted by other anglers who've had experiences similar to mine. They reach out privately, afraid to speak publicly, but wanting to share their stories. A tournament pro who felt something wrap around his motor and had to cut himself free. A guide who watched his client's rod get pulled into the water by something that wasn't a fish. A bank fisherman who saw the water turn dark and viscous, watched as it killed every fish in the cove.
We're forming an unofficial network, sharing information, trying to document what's happening. But we're just fishermen. We don't have the resources or expertise to properly investigate or deal with this. Meanwhile, the colony, if that's what it is, seems to be growing. The incidents are becoming more frequent, covering more area of the lake. What was once confined to a few isolated spots now seems to be spreading throughout the entire reservoir. I think about the dam that created Toledo Bend. It's over 50 years old now. Aging infrastructure that will need major maintenance or replacement eventually. What happens to that colony when they drain the reservoir for dam work? Where does it go? Down the Sabine River into the Gulf of Mexico? Or what if the dam fails catastrophically? What if a major flood breaches it? That colony would flow downstream into the river system, potentially spreading throughout the entire Gulf Coast. I have nightmares about it. I see that dark, seething mass spreading through the waterways of Louisiana and Texas, flowing into the Gulf, contaminating the coastal waters where millions of people live and work and depend on the ocean for their livelihood. I'm 43 years old. Fishing was my whole life, my career, my passion. Now I can't even look at a lake without feeling sick. I took a job at a tackle shop, work in retail, because I need income and it's all I know how to do. But it kills me every day, selling rods and lures to people who are going to fish waters that might not be safe. Customers come in excited about their upcoming trips to Toledo Bend. They ask for advice on techniques and tackle. I want to warn them, want to tell them to go anywhere else. But I can't. They'd think I was crazy.
The shop owner would fire me, and what good would it do anyway? The lake is still open, still legal to fish, still considered safe by every official authority. So I keep quiet. I sell them their tackle, I wish them good luck, and I pray they don't encounter what I encountered. But I know some of them will. The incidents are too frequent now, affecting too many people. It's only a matter of time before something happens that can't be explained away, something so dramatic and public that the authorities have to acknowledge it. I just hope when that happens, it's not too late. I hope we can find a way to contain or eliminate this thing before it spreads beyond Toledo Bend. Because if it does spread, if it gets into the river system and eventually the Gulf, I don't want to think about what that would mean. I don't want to imagine a world where our waterways are no longer safe, where fishing becomes a potentially fatal activity, where the lakes and rivers that have sustained human civilization for thousands of years become hostile territory. But that's the world I see coming. That's what keeps me awake at night, what haunts my dreams. I've seen what's growing in Toledo Bend, and I know it's only a matter of time before it breaks free. God help us all when that day comes. God help anyone who depends on water for their survival. Because I don't think we're ready for what's coming. I don't think we have any idea how to fight it. And I'm terrified that by the time we figure it out, it will already be too late.
Story 10 comes from Daniel Park, a fly fishing instructor from Montana. My name is Daniel Park, and I teach fly fishing in Montana. I've spent the last 15 years guiding clients on the Madison, Yellowstone, and Missouri rivers, teaching them the art of presenting a fly to trout in some of the most beautiful water in the world. Fly fishing isn't just a job for me, it's a calling, a way of life that connects me to nature in ways that few other activities can. I grew up in Bozeman, learned to fish from my grandfather, who was one of the early conservation-minded anglers in the state. He taught me not just how to catch fish, but how to read water, how to understand the ecology of a stream, how to respect the resource. When he passed away 10 years ago, he left me his collection of bamboo rods and his journals documenting 50 years of fishing Montana's waters. I treasure those journals, reading through them often, following in his footsteps to the places he loved. One entry always stood out to me. It was from 1967, and he'd written about a trip into the Bob Marshall Wilderness to a series of beaver ponds on a remote creek. He described the fishing as unnatural, too easy, too many fish, all of them acting strange. He wrote that he'd caught and released over 50 trout in 2 hours, an unprecedented number for such a small water. But at the end of the entry, he'd written something that puzzled me. "Will not return. Something wrong with that water. The fish know it, even if I don't." I'd always wondered what he meant by that. My grandfather wasn't superstitious or prone to exaggeration. If he said something was wrong, he had good reason. But he never mentioned those ponds again in his journals, never went back despite the exceptional fishing. Last August, I had a private client named Graham, a tech executive from Seattle, who wanted to learn backcountry fly fishing. He was an experienced angler, had fished all over the world, but he'd never done a wilderness pack trip. He wanted the authentic Montana experience: horses, camping, fishing water that rarely saw pressure. I arranged a trip into the Bob Marshall Wilderness with an outfitter friend named Tom, who had the permits and horses for the journey. The plan was 3 days fishing remote streams, camping at established sites, immersing Graham in the wilderness experience he craved. We rode in on a Monday morning in mid-August. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, temperatures in the 70s, no wind. The trail followed a creek that eventually fed into the South Fork of the Flathead River, winding through dense lodgepole pine forest and occasional meadows where elk grazed. The first day's fishing was excellent. We worked our way up the main creek, catching native West Slope cutthroat trout on dry flies. The fish were beautiful, golden flanks marked with bright red slashes under their jaws, spots concentrated toward their tails. Graham was thrilled, said it was the best fishing he'd ever experienced. That night around the campfire, Tom mentioned that if we wanted even better fishing, there was a series of beaver ponds about 2 hours upstream that supposedly held some large trout. He said, "I've never been up there myself. It's off the main trail, pretty rough terrain, but I've heard stories from old-timers about the fishing being incredible." Something about the way he said it reminded me of my grandfather's journal entry. I asked, "What creek?" Tom checked his map. "It looks like it's called Mystery Creek on here, though that might not be the official name." I felt a chill despite the warm fire. That was the same creek my grandfather had written about. "Do you know anyone who's fished those ponds recently?" Tom shook his head. "Not really. Like I said, it's pretty remote. Most clients are happy fishing the main creek." "Why?" I almost told him about my grandfather's journal entry, about the warning, but Graham was already excited about the possibility of exploring new water, and I didn't want to seem like I was making decisions based on a 50-year-old journal entry that might not even be relevant anymore. "Just curious," I said. "We can check it out tomorrow if Graham's interested." The next morning we left Tom with the horses and hiked upstream with just our fishing gear and day packs. The trail was faint, overgrown in places, clearly not used much. We followed the creek as it climbed through increasingly dense forest, crossing several tributaries, scrambling over deadfall. About 90 minutes into the hike, Graham stopped. "You smell that?" I did. There was an odor in the air, faint but distinct. Metallic, like copper or iron, mixed with something organic, like blood and decay combined. "Probably just a dead elk or deer," I said, though I wasn't convinced. The smell was too evenly distributed, not concentrated, like it would be around a carcass. We continued hiking. The forest around us had grown quieter. I'd been hearing birds all morning, Clark's nutcrackers, Steller's jays, varied thrushes, but now there was just silence. Even the creek seemed quieter, its usual burbling muted somehow. When we finally reached the beaver ponds, I understood why my grandfather had never returned. There were 3 ponds, each separated by a beaver dam, stepping up the valley like terraces. The lowest pond was maybe an acre in size, the others progressively smaller. But everything about them was wrong. The water was too dark, almost black, despite the bright afternoon sun filtering through the trees. The surface was completely still. No rings from rising fish, no insects skating across it, no ripples from wind. The beaver dams looked old and unmaintained, the lodges abandoned. And the smell was much stronger here, that copper and decay odor thick enough to make my eyes water. "This is amazing," Graham said, already pulling out his rod. "Look at the size of that pond. There must be huge trout in there." "Wait," I said, grabbing his arm. "Let's look around first." We walked along the shoreline of the lowest pond. The vegetation near the water was dead or dying. Brown grass, withered willows, even the sedges that usually thrive in wetlands looked sickly. And then I saw the fish. They were lying along the shoreline, partially in the water, partially on the mud. Cutthroat trout. Some of them quite large, 18, 20 inches, fish that would be trophies in most waters. But they were dead, had been dead for a while based on their condition. Except their condition was wrong. These fish weren't decomposing normally. Their flesh looked milted, dissolved in irregular patterns that didn't match how bacteria or scavengers work. Parts of them were just gone, leaving behind skeletal structure and patches of skin. And where the flesh remained, it had a strange texture, almost crystalline, like it had been partially mineralized. "Jesus," Graham whispered. What happened to them? I don't know, but we're not fishing here. We're leaving right now. Come on, Dan. They probably died from natural causes, maybe a disease or something. The live fish should be fine. There are no live fish. Look at the water. No rises, no movement, nothing. This pond is dead. Graham looked like he wanted to argue, but then the water began to move. Not ripples or waves. The entire surface of the pond started to undulate, rising and falling slowly like something underneath was breathing. We both stepped back from the shoreline. The undulation continued, the water level in the pond actually rising several inches, lapping higher on the banks. And the color of the water was changing, becoming less black and more of a dark gray, with an oily sheen on the surface. "What the hell is that?" Graham asked. I didn't answer. I was watching the center of the pond where something was beginning to surface. It started as just a dark shape beneath the water, but it was rising, coming up slowly, but steadily. When it broke the surface, I felt my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. It looked like a mass of vegetation, pond weeds or algae, but it was moving with purpose, reaching upward like fingers grasping. The strands were dark green to black, thick as rope, and covered in a slime that dripped back into the water. And there were things embedded in the mass, not just plant matter, but other things. I could see what looked like pieces of fish, bones, even what might have been part of a beaver skull. All of it was being held together by those ropey strands, incorporated into the mass like it was collecting material, building itself. The mass rose higher, maybe 6 feet above the water now, and more strands were emerging from the pond, dozens of them, all reaching and grasping at the air. Where drops of slime fell back into the water, the surface would ripple and then go still, and I could see the water in those spots taking on that same gray color. "We need to go," I said quietly. "Back away slowly. Don't run. Don't make sudden movements."
Graham didn't argue this time. We both started backing away from the pond, keeping our eyes on the mass. It wasn't following us, seemed content to just wave its strands in the air, but I didn't trust that. There was something purposeful about its movements, something that suggested intelligence, or at least awareness. We'd backed up maybe 20 yards when Graham stumbled over a log and fell. His rod clattered against a rock, the sound echoing in the silent forest. The mass stopped moving. All those strands froze in place, pointing in various directions like antennae searching for a signal. Then, as one, they all turned toward us. "Run!" I said. We ran. I grabbed Graham's arm and pulled him to his feet, and we crashed back down the trail as fast as the terrain would allow. Behind us, I heard splashing, like those strands were slapping the water, and then a wet, sliding sound, like something large dragging itself onto the bank. I didn't look back. I just ran, pulling Graham along, jumping over logs, dodging trees, not caring about technique or safety, just focused on putting distance between us and that pond. We ran for maybe 10 minutes before I had to stop, gasping for breath, my lungs burning. Graham collapsed against a tree, his face pale and sweating. "Is it following us?" he managed to ask between breaths. I listened. Nothing, just the sound of the creek and our own ragged breathing. Whatever that thing was, it apparently hadn't pursued us. Maybe it was confined to the pond. Maybe it had just been warning us away. I didn't know, and didn't want to find out. When we'd caught our breath, we made our way back down to camp. Tom took one look at us and knew something had happened. "The ponds?" he asked. I nodded. "What did you see?" I tried to explain, but the words sounded crazy even to my own ears. A mass of vegetation that moved like it was alive, that incorporated dead fish and bones, that seemed aware of us. Tom listened without interrupting.
When he finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The Salish people who originally lived in this area have a name for that place. In English, it translates roughly to where the water eats. It's considered sacred in the sense that it's forbidden, a place where spirits or something else lives that shouldn't be disturbed." "Why didn't you tell us this before?" Graham asked, his voice sharp. "Because most people think it's just superstition. I've had dozens of clients ask about those ponds over the years, and I always discourage it by saying the access is too difficult. But you two seemed experienced enough to handle rough terrain, and I figured you'd turn back if you saw anything concerning." "We should report this," Graham said. "Call the Forest Service. Get them to investigate." Tom and I exchanged looks. "Report what?" Tom asked. "That we saw something weird in a pond? They'll think we're crazy. And even if they did investigate, what would they find? That mass might only appear sometimes or might hide when people approach. We have no proof." Graham pulled out his phone, but of course there was no signal this deep in the wilderness. "I'm reporting it when we get back to civilization." That night, Graham started feeling sick. He complained of nausea and headache, said his skin felt like it was burning. By morning, he had a fever, and his skin was covered in angry red welts, particularly on his hands and forearms, the places that had been exposed when he fell near the pond.
We packed up immediately and rode out. The trip that had taken us 6 hours going in, we completed in 4 hours coming out, pushing the horses as hard as we dared. From the trailhead, we drove Graham straight to the hospital in Kalispell. The doctors were baffled. The welts looked like chemical burns, but didn't respond to normal burn treatments. They ran tests for allergic reactions, bacterial infections, fungal infections. Everything came back negative. Graham's white blood cell count was elevated, suggesting his body was fighting something, but they couldn't identify what. He spent 5 days in the hospital. The welts gradually faded and his fever broke, but he was left with scarring on his hands and forearms. The doctors never did figure out what caused his condition. Their final diagnosis was contact dermatitis of unknown origin, which was basically an admission that they had no idea. Graham did report the incident to the Forest Service when he got out of the hospital. He filed a formal complaint, demanded they investigate the ponds, even threatened legal action if someone else got hurt up there. The Forest Service sent a ranger to interview us. I backed up Graham's story, told the ranger exactly what we'd seen. The ranger was polite but skeptical. He took notes, said they'd look into it. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the Forest Service. They'd send a crew to investigate the area. They'd found the beaver ponds, had taken water samples, and photographed the site. Everything appeared normal. The water was clear, showed normal chemistry. There were no dead fish, no unusual vegetation, no signs of anything concerning. "Are you sure you have the right ponds?" I asked. "We followed your GPS coordinates exactly. We were definitely at the right location. Whatever you think you saw, Mr. Park, it's not there now." After that call, I pulled out my grandfather's journal again and reread his entry about those ponds. At the very end, in small handwriting that I'd overlooked before, he'd written, "Showed Hank the photographs I took. The mass I saw in the water didn't appear in any of the pictures, just clear water and dead fish. Either the camera can't capture it, or it only appears to the human eye, or I'm losing my mind." So my grandfather had photographed it too, and like the Forest Service, had found no evidence in the pictures. Whatever that thing in the pond is, it apparently doesn't show up on camera or only manifests under certain conditions. I've been back to the Bob Marshall Wilderness several times since then, guiding other clients, but I never go near Mystery Creek, and I always warn my outfitter friends away from those ponds. Most of them think I'm being overly cautious,
that I had some kind of incident with a client and I'm traumatized. They don't believe in the danger. But last month, the Forest Service quietly closed the trail to Mystery Creek. No public announcement, just a notice at the trailhead that the area is closed for resource protection and public safety. When I asked a ranger friend about it, he was evasive, said it was a management decision and he couldn't discuss details. I think they know. I think their investigation found something after all, something they're not willing to talk about publicly. Maybe they sent another crew up there and someone else saw what Graham and I saw. Maybe someone got hurt worse than Graham did. I don't know, and they won't tell me.
What I do know is that my grandfather was right to stay away, and I was foolish to ignore his warning. That place, those ponds, harbor something that shouldn't exist, something that's been there for who knows how long, maybe centuries, maybe longer. The Salish people knew to avoid it. My grandfather learned to avoid it. And now I know too. I still teach fly fishing, still take clients into the wilderness, but I'm more careful now about where I go, more attentive to the warnings, both the official ones and the unofficial ones passed down through stories and journals. Because I've learned that not all water is safe, that there are places where things live that we don't understand and probably can't fight. The wilderness is vast and largely unexplored. We've mapped it, we've named the peaks and rivers, but we haven't truly explored every creek and pond, every hidden valley. And maybe we shouldn't. Maybe some places are better left alone, some waters better left unfished. I think about Graham sometimes, about how close we came to something worse than just burns in a hospital stay. What if he'd fallen into the pond instead of just near it? What if those strands had grabbed him, pulled him under? Would we have been able to save him? Or would I have had to return to camp without him, trying to explain how my client had been taken by something I couldn't describe? I dream about those ponds occasionally. In the dreams, I'm standing at the edge of the lowest pond, and the mass is rising from the water. But this time, I can't move. I'm frozen in place, watching as those ropey strands reach toward me. And I can see that they're not just plant material. They're partly organic, partly something else. Something that doesn't fit into any category of life I understand. And in the dream, the mass speaks. Not with words, but with feelings that get pushed directly into my mind. Hunger, patience, ancient awareness, and the knowledge that it's been in those ponds for longer than human beings have existed, and it will still be there long after we're gone. I wake from these dreams in a cold sweat, grateful to be in my bed, safe in my house, but the feeling stays with me for hours. That sense of having encountered something so alien, so fundamentally different from anything in my experience that my mind can barely process it. The mountains are full of mysteries. Some of them are beautiful, the way sunlight filters through morning mist, the rise of a trout to a perfectly presented fly. But some of them are dark, dangerous things that are better left undiscovered. I tell my students now to respect the water, to pay attention to their instincts, to recognize when something feels wrong even if they can't articulate why. And I tell them about my grandfather, about how the best anglers aren't just skilled with a rod, they're also wise enough to know when to walk away. Because sometimes the biggest fish aren't worth catching. Sometimes the most remote waters aren't worth exploring, and sometimes the price of curiosity is higher than anyone should have to pay.